Hello, everyone, and we are now live. It is that time for the Zodcast. Thanks for everybody for tuning in tonight. Tonight, a very special guest, my good friend, Professor Thomas Henry Horan, who you saw not too long ago in the Myth of the Zodiac documentary. We'll be talking about that quite a bit. He got me involved in that documentary. Very grateful to him for that. Turned out really well. He knows a lot. We haven't even talked at all about some more behind the scenes stuff that went on that he knows about that I don't. That could have been in the documentary. There's just only enough time to put everything in when it was. I think it was only 2 hours, but there was probably enough material to make a 10-hour documentary. So we'll get into that some for sure. And I wanted to mention congratulations to my good friend Steve Stockton on the birth of his son. His name is Holden Chandler Stockton. So congratulations to Steve and his wife on the birth of his son. Steve's one of my favorite YouTubers. Taught me a lot about doing all things YouTube, and of course catch his channel on Missing Persons Mysteries, Steve's channel. So congratulations there. Hey Richard, how are you? So without any further ado, I'm going to bring on my good friend Professor Thomas Henry Horan. We already talked a little bit before the show about some fascinating stuff, and so how you been? I know it's been a while.
Hi, Drew. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on. I've looked forward to this for years. I've promised my viewers for years, and I'm going to promise your viewers for years. Finally, one of the reasons I've been so secretive about the Zodiac for all these years is it took 12 years to get the show finally aired on TV. And I want to thank you for being on it. You were a major asset, and honestly, it was probably when you agreed to be on the show, that probably put it over the top because they wanted people, Tom Voight won't do it. They didn't like him, blah, 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 blah. You were knowledgeable. You had all this fresh information.
You said the name, so we got to do a ghost scream. That's our tradition here on the Zodcast.
I love it. So you were a huge asset, and you were great on the show. We almost crossed paths because I was having lunch at the Pinecrest on my day off.
Oh, wow.
They were shooting your scenes somewhere else in the city, and
it was in Benicia. It was in a house in Benicia.
Okay.
Did you do anything there, or you because you were out there at Lake Herman Road, and that I didn't. Mine was all there. Was in this house they were in Benicia.
You saw I don't want to blab too much. We still kind of have a contract with those guys, but
yeah.
Did you see the drone footage of? I think they found the legendary pink house that was busted that night.
No, I didn't see anything.
Yeah, that was when we went out there.
There's probably a lot I don't know.
There's so much they may use in the future, so I probably shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, they could. I know they like we were saying before the show. They've got a lot on the cutting room floor. I had a lot that didn't get in, which I was happy with what they did. I understand, that's how it works. You might choose, I don't know, 20-30% of what makes sense and put it all together and come up with something that makes sense. But yeah, they've got enough material left to make another doc out of it for sure.
But I was so happy. I just want your viewers to know, if they haven't seen it, it's still on Peacock. Sometimes it pops up on Oxygen. It just recently ran again in Britain. It's been running around the world. It's a different take on the case, but they did so much it's a great documentary. Some people might find it a little bit boring because there's so much they don't know about the real Zodiac killer case. But they went out and they got witnesses that had never talked before. They got Darlene's ex-husband, Jim Phillips Crabtree, to blab on camera, and you and I are going to talk about that in a second. So
yeah, well, we might as well do it now because he's always been on the. Because I had no idea they were going to even get him, and I know there was different people that were asked, and I know you said Andrew tried to get, of course, Andrew Knock, the producer, tried to get Robert Graysmith, and we'll talk about him. But how did it all develop? Did you know that Crabtree was going to be on?
I think there was a point. I think Andrew told me after he had gone and interviewed Crabtree that he'd been on camera, but this was not. I just want to say the documentary is not just taking this book and making a TV show. This documentary on Peacock is they read the book thoroughly and spent years, and this got passed from one network to the next. Follow up. They went out and found So they follow up on this book. Like, is this possible? Is there any corroborating evidence? So this book is like chapter 1 of the story. The Peacock documentary, the NBC documentary, it's called Myth of the Zodiac Killer. It was very nice of them to use the title. That was very nice of them to do that. And so that documentary is chapter 2. Then there's the next couple hundred chapters I have. There's all these chapters that you have contributed that we haven't even had a chance to talk about, and I have to catch up on your show. And then there's the stuff that Ross Garossi did. So all that stuff actually fits together, even though you guys, I haven't even had a chance. People don't understand. You and I have barely spoken.
Yeah, we never even got to huddle up before the show.
That's
because
right.
You're not supposed to talk about certain things, or we don't want them to slip because we both do a YouTube show. So we obeyed that.
Right. So we have so much to talk about. So people subscribe to my YouTube channel. Drew's going to be on all the time. Ross is going to be. We're going to do a lot more of the gang getting together. I call them the wingmen, but they're not my wingmen. We're just the wingmen. Whatever. Where we do, and then I've got the technology, so your viewers can watch our streams on your YouTube, and Ross's fans can watch on there. We can multi-stream to multiple YouTubes. So I think so. YouTube sometimes gets a little antsy about the same content going out, but it should look different on each version. So we'll see. It should be able to do that. So, and if in any case, they won't be paid. I do have a members only premium YouTube, but the shows that you and Ross and I do together, those will be free for everybody. They'll be ad supported, but they'll be free for everybody. So we have so much to talk about. There is so much that people don't know about the Zodiac Killer case, and I haven't been able to talk about all these years. It's mountains of stuff. And the first thing you have to understand is the standard story of the Zodiac Killer, a serial killer, lonely guy writing letters to the newspapers, committed all these murders, and he proved it, and everybody. No, that's not what happened. So, and like viewers of your channel, like there's so much more about Paul Avery and Don Chaney. There's so much more. And I think tonight you and I were going to talk a little bit about Jim and Darlene Farron, her ex-husband.
Right. So explain that again. So obviously Dean Farron was her husband at the time that she was murdered, and she was working at Terry's Waffles House in Vallejo. Before that, she worked at the IHOP that was close to Arkley Allen's house, of course, famously on 32 Fresno. But she was married to how long was she married to Crabtree? And is Jim Phillips Crabtree? This guy has 18 different names, but he was going by Crabtree, I guess, when they were married.
Well, let me try to summarize this. Jim and Darlene were never married. Jim
Is that
has
right?
only.
I thought they were.
That's right. No.
So I just learned something new. I thought they were legally married.
No, they were never legally married.
Was it like a common law deal, or
they weren't together that long, but they posed as husband and wife.
So sort of common law. And
when Jim drops
California equivalent,
right? Yeah, technically, if you want to claim widow's benefits, you had to be married. You had to be living together 7 years to be common law. But yeah, basically a common law. Which in those days, women couldn't be single. Like, you had to have a husband. So they passed as husband and wife. But when Jim drops all these little hints that he might have been some kind of spook back in the 60s, that was part of it. She was the one who had the jobs, and he would sponge off of her. But the jobs that she had turn out to be very interesting. So they were never legally married. He was using her for sure. But a lot of this, like when I say that people know nothing about the Zodiac Killer case, there was nothing random about any of the victims. But at the time, and this is exactly the same thing in Son of Sam. This is actually a continuation of activities. Zodiac and Son of Sam. The victims are all high school or college age. They don't go to the same school, and they don't work at the same hamburger shop. There doesn't seem to be any connection between them, and their friends can't think of any connection between them. And their parents don't, they say they can't think of it, but in real life, the connection between the Zodiac victims is not the kids, it's the parents. The parents are connected, and they're connected in ways that explain the motive for the murders.
Wow. I love to talk about the parents. I mean, because I learn as much as I can about the parents too.
And this is true, and also in the Son of Sam murders, same thing. High school, college age kids, don't go to the same school, don't live in the same suburbs. There's no connection between them. But it's the parents. The parents are all involved in something. It's a slightly different thing, but it's a connected thing. So in the Zodiac murders, the fathers, and I think even Darlene's mom, they all worked in top secret defense plants, or so like Darlene's father, Leo,
Right.
was right. He's a machinist engineer, a very, very highly trained machinist at Mare Island. He worked specifically in submarine shed X-58 or X-52, where they worked on the big nuclear submarines. And her actual father-in-law, Dean Farron's father, Mr. Farron, not Andrew Farron, Mr. Farron he did the electronics. So what Darlene's dad did basically was they would, at the Corona Naval Laboratory in Riverside, California, they were building these underwater cameras for the submarines, and using very special lenses, which are manufactured in Canada by the Lights Camera Company. They also manufacture lenses for spy satellites. So at Corona Naval Laboratory in Riverside, California, where Sherry Joe Bates's father was a machinist,
right,
they're manufacturing.
He's a Navy. He was a Navy with the Navy. I mean, I think he was.
Right.
I don't know if he worked for the Navy, but I don't know if he was actually enlisted or worked in the like an arsenal, right? I mean, it was like
at Corona. He worked at Corona Naval Laboratory in Riverside, California. They built spy satellites and the underwater cameras for submarines and things. And then Darlene's father installed them on the submarines. And as a matter of fact, Darlene is murdered July 4th, 1969. August the 1st, 1969. The next big submarine is literally is docked at Mare Island in shed X-58, X-52. I can't remember which one it is. The Leo worked in, having $20 million, which in those days, $20 million, it's like $2 billion today. $20 million worth of these electronic and cameras installed that Darlene's father and father-in-law are installing on this submarine.
Wow. I wonder if they went cross paths with Paul Avery's adoptive father. Howard Malcolm Avery was a Navy guy that worked in outside of Bakersfield. I can't remember the area, but he was in all that too, like arsenal stuff.
See what I mean? I didn't know that.
And of course, Arthur Lee Allen's father was Navy, of course, a Navy pilot. Ethan Warren. I mean,
and he
Ethan
worked
Allen,
at
Ethan Warren
he worked at Mare Island.
Right. And
there's a very good chance. A very good chance that Arthur Lee Allen knew Darlene. That doesn't mean that he was
you would think. Well, you would at minimum you would think that Arthur Lee Allen would have known Darlene, because I've walked from his home to where the IHOP was. Now it's a Mexican restaurant. It's literally you could throw a rock from Allen's front yard and hit the building with it. Right, it's that close. So I would assume that he'd go over there for a meal once in a while because it was so close to his house. He didn't even have to drive there. And she was a waitress there for a good amount of time, where Dean was a cook, I believe, at that same IHOP before she moves on to Terry's Waffle House, where she's working when she's murdered.
That's not even the most interesting thing about that IHOP. That was one of the very first IHOP franchises in the United States. Do you know who owned it? Do you know who owned it? The son of a paperclip Nazi machinist.
Wow.
There was this engineer.
That particular
machinist,
franchise. That particular store.
That particular franchise.
Yeah.
Not only that, but
see, that's deep.
So going back to Mare Island, now you have at Corona Naval Laboratories, where they built the Corona spy satellites. These are film based. These are big cameras. The satellites are like the size of a pickup truck or a van. Got this big camera. It takes all these pictures, and then the satellite has to come back down to Earth, and they recover the satellite and develop the pictures. Sometimes this works, sometimes this doesn't. This is the Corona series. These are built at Corona Naval Laboratory in Riverside, California. Jim's brother Otis was a Navy machinist at Corona Naval Laboratories in the late 1960s. And not only that, Jim was back in town. And not only that, Jim would stay with his brothers. Jim's not adopted.
Back in town, you mean Vallejo?
No, Riverside.
Oh, you mean Riverside? Okay.
Riverside. Jim was not adopted.
I thought he
That's a
was.
lie. That's a lie. He
I
was
always thought he was
illegitimate.
adopted.
No, he was just illegitimate. He was his father's name was Diamond. The name is actually Bell Phillips. It's a hyphenated name. Bell
Ah,
Phillips. They're
kind of like
from
Granny
Alabama.
Smith and
Well, it's one of those old money names from the South. The Bell Phillips
Mhm.
plantation was the Bell Phillipses were a big planter family in Alabama and Mississippi.
Huh.
So they moved to after the Civil War, they moved to Missouri, and a bunch of them become Mormons.
Ah, that's interesting. I love any
And
Mormon connection. I don't know why. Don't maybe
and
Avery.
well, because the Seventh-day Adventists came out of the same movement as the Mormons, and they're all over Northern California. Of course, they're in they're in Napa. You know, they have Pacific Union College. So so Diamond Bell Phillips, his first wife gave birth to all of his sons. His second wife, Kathleen Crabtree.
Oh, okay.
See, he's divorced and married. He's married. Jim's biological parents are Kathleen Crabtree, later Mrs. Diamond Bell Phillips, and Diamond Bell Phillips. He was just born out of wedlock. He'd married another woman, and then he has this other kid with Kathleen Crabtree. So he has these brothers who look exactly like him, and one lives in Reno, where Donna Lass disappeared. One lives in Riverside and works at Corona Naval Laboratory as a machinist right alongside Sherry Jo Bates' father, Joseph Bates. And Jim was in, and he has two other brothers. I think one was a doctor, and then one brother shot the other brother. Their father was horribly abusive. He was extremely violent. At one point, he and his daughter were living together as husband and wife, and publicly living together as husband and wife. So Jim, on his birth certificate, because he's illegitimate, his name is Crabtree. But Kathleen married Diamond, but Diamond never adopted Jim. Jim was never adopted, and he was never married to Darlene. So
Right.
I don't know. To this day, I don't think
They always
anybody
called him
really
husband,
knows.
so maybe it's just a common law type. Present, like you said, they
It's
presented
also a
himself
cover.
that way.
Right, because she had to get the jobs that she got. She couldn't be single. She had to be married. She had to be
Yeah.
respectable. She had to be respectable. So Jim, and his brothers, he would sponge off of his brothers. So he's around for Sherry Jo Bates' murder. He's around for some other murders that take place that are very, very suspicious. And it gets wilder than that. When he and Darlene were living in Albany, New York, Darlene was working for the New York Bell Telephone Company. That's a very, very interesting coincidence I'll go into on my show sometime. But while they're there, there's a family living in Buffalo. And the father of that family, about the same age as Leo Suennen, maybe a little bit older than Leo Suennen, he's also an engineer machinist, and he was a Nazi spy. And he was one of the founders of the German-American Bund. And in 1937, he takes his wife and kids and he moves back to Nazi Germany near Stuttgart. There's a small town near Stuttgart where he was from. And he works for Messerschmitt. He works for Volkswagen. He probably is he's the guy who made the swing axle parts for Adolf Hitler's prototype VW Beetle. That's how important this guy was.
I was saying on this show a week or two ago how you just can't get rid of the VW Beetles in all these cases, from Bundy all the way down Yuba County 5. The Beetle
funny
shows
thing
up. I mean, it's a
is,
popular car. I get it. They were everywhere back then, but it's funny how they always turn up.
So he's a founder of the German-American Bund, which is involved in the phony kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby.
Yeah,
and
we could go on about that forever because I think Lindbergh was involved with his own child's kidnapping.
So while he works, in Buffalo, he works for General Motors and he works for Wright Aero, and I think he worked because he had all this really advanced German machine knowledge. He's hired as a consulting engineer machinist at several very important plants, a lot of them defense plants in Buffalo, New York. 1937, he takes the family back to Germany. He works at Stuttgart, and his son is raised in the Hitler Youth and everything. Well, 1955, they're allowed to come back to the United States, even though he was a Nazi spy. So they come back to the United States.
Was that part of Paperclip?
Well, I used Paperclip.
That was pre-World War II, right? I mean, no, it was after World War II.
No, that was that. I used Paperclip in kind of a generic sense. He was a spy. He's a spy who was allowed to come back to the United States and work in the automotive industry. So many of those guys either worked in aerospace or automotive industry. Lots and lots and lots of automotive industry guys in the 30s were
Wasn't Henry Ford
Nazis.
Like one of those guys, like pro back in the day,
of course.
German.
Well, there's that. So the son and the mother, 20 years later, well, it's less than 20 years later, 15 years later, they buy and set up one of the very first IHOP franchises, and this is in Vallejo, California.
That's interesting.
And Jim and Darlene moved back from upstate New York to Vallejo so that Darlene can get a job at the new IHOP, which is owned by these Nazis.
That's interesting.
And the only reason
I've never heard about who owned that IHOP.
Well, not only is that interesting, but you've seen the famous picture of Jim and Darlene with the unknown man. I got a copy of it.
Hey,
somewhere.
look, no, hold on. I have some pictures here. I have some pictures right here. Now,
that's that guy right there on the left.
Who's the guy on the left with the glass? Because I've heard a million different explanations for who that is. Because when they first showed that, everybody thought it was Jim Crabtree, but it's not.
Close. Who is that guy? It's real close. It's real close. Jim would go so far as to say he looks like me and he's older than I am, but it's not me. Now, Jim understood that house belonged to an orthopedic surgeon. I think the orthopedic surgeon might have been renting the house, but I can tell you who owned the house. That house was owned by an actual, officially paper-clipped Nazi named Horst Heinz Eifler. Horst Heinz Eifler was one of the most highly decorated soldiers in Hitler's Waffen-SS. He had won so many Iron Crosses first class, Hitler invented a new medal to give to Horst and a few other guys who had won some of these guys had won the equivalent of 12 or 13 Pour le Mérites. Like they over and over and over again in vicious combat on the Eastern Front, they win this Nazi Cross in Gold. Horst Heinz Eifler was awarded the Nazi Cross in Gold. He was taken prisoner at Stalingrad. And because they knew that he would be tough and resourceful and he was going to survive, they paper clipped his brother, and his brother those are all brand new houses in that little neighborhood. His brother built a house, a couple houses away from that house that Jim and the guy is standing in. Horst owned, when he came over in 55, they brought him over in 55, they built a house for him to live in. So you've got Darlene working for a paperclip Nazi family, and her photograph is taken in a house belonged to another paperclip Nazi. And who's the guy standing next to her if it's not Jim, but looks like Jim?
But
maybe he's related to Jim. It's not. That's Jim's brother, Otis Phillips.
I've never heard. I've heard. I can't even remember. There's been so many over the years because that picture's been around. And first people said it was Jim, and then they said no, it's somebody else. Or I can't even remember the different names that have come up.
Well,
over the years, or explanations or who it could have been. But one was never Jim's brother.
You know who put it on his website and said that was Gaikowski. That's where that photograph first popped up.
That looks nothing like Gaikowski. Number one.
I know. But it looks exactly like Jim. And it turns out, and you can see that on my YouTube channel. It's one of the premium episodes. That's Jim's brother, Otis, who worked at Corona Naval Laboratory.
Was Otis older or younger than Jim?
He was about 20 years older, but Jim said he was an older guy, but he looked young and he looked a lot like me, but it wasn't me. Jim claims that guy's an orthopedic surgeon, but maybe an orthopedic surgeon was renting the house. I may
have heard at one point he was some form of doctor. Like, I don't know, maybe somebody on Reddit thought they figured out who this guy was and he was some doctor. I don't remember if it was a
Jim might have thought so. Jim might have thought so because they're not going to tell people, oh, you know who owns this house, right? Some big Nazi war hero. So this guy survives not only 3 years of World War II PO'd, then he's in a Soviet gulag and not released until 1955, and then they bring him to the United States. at the same time
So
that they bring the Schaefers or whoever it was who owned the IHOP in Vallejo. They came over almost on the same plane.
wow. So who's this guy on the top right? Next to the other guy. Is that Crabtree as a younger man, or did they ever figure that out? Because I've seen this picture a lot too. This guy with the tie.
He's supposed to be. That's supposed to be Jim in high school.
Is it? Or we don't know for sure.
No, I don't know. I don't know. With Jim,
of course, that's Jim from the documentary below
know.
that. Of course, we know that's the real Jim below there from the documentary.
Yeah, and he has tried to do little tricks to cover his tracks and stuff, but like he's a very good suspect of the murder of a woman in an apartment building that he managed.
You see a lot of that. I mean, you see a lot of these cases getting solved now with DNA, and it turns out to be just some random guy that knew somebody from an apartment complex, murdered whoever, raped and killed, and then gets subscribed to a serial killer, and then they found out it was a guy that lived 4 doors down at the apartments. Now that the DNA is getting better and better.
Now, everybody knows that Jim and Darlene supposedly went to the Virgin Islands in 1966, 67.
I remember that.
And Jim supposedly owned a newspaper there. Now, he might have, and I'll tell you why. Because there was only one newspaper that's ever been published in the Virgin Islands, and that's called the Virgin Islands View. And I do think, because this is the exact same time that the company, this right-wing, not just right-wing, but, the establishment, PepsiCo, Standard Oil, General Dynamics, the Bushes, those guys start a newspaper, it's still around, called the San Juan, Puerto Rico Star, which was a CIA newspaper, basically. So the journalists are gathering intelligence, and the San Juan Star is publishing propaganda. Well, that's on the mainland. The only other English language newspaper ever in Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, was the Virgin Islands View. And I'm pretty sure Jim might be telling the truth, that he went down there as an representative of the company, and went down there and temporarily took ownership of that newspaper. But the guy who bought it, almost the exact same time that Jim and Darlene supposedly leave the Virgin Islands, the guy who buys the Virgin Islands View is Kelsey Grammer's father.
Right.
What was his name? Kelsey Grammer's father. He buys the Virgin Islands View, which is the only newspaper Jim could have owned or worked for at all. And see, Jim had just recently worked at the Albany Times-Union, which was a newspaper that the CIA got going again to publish right-wing stories and things in Albany, New York. That seems to be his job. He kind of helps get these newspapers off the ground. He doesn't do much of anything else like writing or editing, but he does kind of go around and get these newspapers off the ground. And so, of course, in 1968, in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., there's a riot in the Virgin Islands, and the publisher of The View, Mr. Grammer, is murdered by the mob. He's lynched by the mob.
I remember, right.
So, not too long after that, Kelsey Grammer's sister is murdered in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
That's right. I think so. She moved from Florida.
And the funny thing is, when Mr. Grammer is murdered in the Virgin Islands, Jim is out of the country. He supposedly went to Mexico, but I can't find any records of exactly where he went. But when Mr. Grammer is murdered, Jim is out of the country. And there's this rumor that Darlene was nervous about Jim stalking her because she and Jim had something to do, witnessed a murder, or something happened in the Virgin Islands. And I think that's exactly what they're talking about.
Did that come from one of her sisters, or was that?
It was one of her sisters, one of her friends, one of her coworkers. It's not that Jim had been stalking her. See, to make a long story short, all these names I've been dropping, I think the motive for Darlene's murder was, you may have heard of Darlene's address book that was found in her car.
Almost all Zodiac researchers are familiar with that. And I've gone through like every name in there. There was a guy named Granite, which is interesting if I'm pronouncing it right. It looked like it was spelled like granite. Who was an attorney in San Francisco, and of course I like that.
Well, so were some other famous people. That's not Darlene's address book. That's Jim's address book.
That's right. No, that's correct. It was Jim's.
And
but she had it in her possession or something.
It was in the car because Jim bought her that car. See, there's all this stuff about just how many Corvairs there were. Well, here's an interesting coincidence. This Mr. was it Schaefer, who had gone back to Nazi Germany to work for Hitler and build Hitler's VW for him, and very specifically, it seems like he specialized in this revolutionary technology called a swing axle. I think Corvettes have them too, right? A rear engine car with the two axles that come out with the CV joints. I think that's called a swing axle. Well, he comes back to Buffalo, New York, and goes to work for the rest of his career at General Motors Gear and Axle plant in Buffalo, New York, where he helps them design and he builds and he supervises the manufacturing of the swing axles for the Chevrolet Corvair. The swing axles in Darlene's Corvair, either he was the guy operating the machinery building those swing axles or whatever. And the dealership where Jim apparently bought that car is actually very interesting as well. But there are addresses in Jim's address book that turn out to be paperclip Nazis, and they turn out to be Operation Chaos agents in San Francisco. I think the motive for Darlene's murder was not to get the address book back because that would be obvious. But once Darlene was dead, nobody would know what those names actually meant. There are names and addresses in that book that will blow your wig off. And I
can't remember them all. Just Granite just comes to mind, but I looked at a lot of them. But because of course the police did too for suspects. But how long had she been estranged from Jim before she marries Dean? I think she was legally married to Dean Farron. At least a year and a half, right?
Except for he kept coming back and forth. I think this story that she hadn't seen him, I don't think that was true. I think that was, she was told to say that and she was scared to admit, but there's things going on between them that there's more contact between them during that time than her family either knew about or told police about. So, and there's so much more about Jim and Darlene that people don't know, they didn't know anything about. And it explains the motives for the murders because this all has to do. Now, here's where it gets crazy. This industry that the Zodiac victims' parents are working in, that's the industry when Oswald went to Russia. Apparently, this is in those declassified FBI files. Oswald worked at a factory called Horizon, which is Russian Horizon. He worked at the Horizon facility of Minsk Radio, where they manufactured components for rockets and satellites. Now, how did he get that job? Because according to his Marine Corps records, he was a scope dope. In the military, you either learned how to repair radar equipment or you learned how to operate it, but you did not know both. So if all he was a scope dope, just watching radar and phoning in reports, how did he get the job at Russia's most advanced aeronautics electronics factory? He must have had some training, because how could he bluff his way into that job? So I wondered if maybe all these machinists their kids are getting killed, maybe they're the ones who secretly trained Oswald and their kids are getting bumped off as a warning to keep their mouths shut, because it's right about this time that, what's her name? Mae Brussel is starting to make noise about how the official version of the CIA might be involved in the assassination of Kennedy. And it just seems funny that the people,
the CIA was involved with that.
And remember, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, their network of spies were machinist engineers at all these defense plants, not just at Los Alamos. Her brother worked at Los Alamos. That was their spy network. It's very likely that, whether he knew it or not, like Leo Suenin might have been duped by the Rosenbergs, because Julius's job was to travel around to all these defense plants across the country, mostly doing electronics work, but making sure that, he's double checking that they're sticking to, he's got all the blueprints. So this is where he gets all of his information to pass along to the Soviets. Remember, I think only 2 other members of their network were ever caught. They went to the gas chamber rather than name names. So I think it's possible that Leo Suenin was either willing or unwilling or unknowingly a member of the Rosenberg spy ring.
I've never heard that before. That would definitely be a new one.
Now, you've heard of the Gilgo Beach serial killer Rex Horan, accused,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
Do you know
Right.
what his father? Do you know what his father did for a living?
No.
When they finished the Corona series of film-based spy satellites, they moved to a intermediate step called Hexagon. Those were built at Perkin-Elmer in Connecticut. That's where Rex Horaman's father worked. He was a machinist engineer at Perkin-Elmer building spy satellites.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
of course,
that's-
JohnBenet Ramsay's father, JohnBenet Ramsay, owns a company that is processing the digital photographs that are coming. The next series of satellites are called Keyhole. You go Corona, Hexagon, Keyhole. Operation
Yeah.
Keyhole is fully digital satellites. One of them is called the Hubble telescope. They're pointed back at Earth, and the company that is processing those images and stitching them together into a map of the Earth is called Access Graphics, a subsidiary of Lockheed.
Yep. Access Graphic. Yep. Boulder, Colorado. And who gave him the funding to open up that business was his father-in-law, Don Pa, who's an interesting guy. Of course, we go down the rabbit hole.
yeah.
Don Pa, a high-level
Oh,
Freemason from good old West Virginia, home of Ned DeHaan. Yeah, really high up Freemason.
Really?
Not a wealthy guy at all. Not a wealthy guy, but high up in Masonry was Don Pa, who did get the funding for his son-in-law to start Access Graphics. And then they moved from Atlanta to Boulder, of course, famously. And then both his daughters are Miss West Virginia, so he had a little stroke. And that wasn't based on their beauty and talent, I don't think, in either case.
Well, and but it was a much smaller thing in those days when she was a little girl. Patsy was a little girl. It was a much smaller hobby. So back to Son of Sam really quick. Sam Carr, because John Carr is the son of Sam, right? Sam Carr and his wife Frances, they met when they were in the Army. They were counterintelligence corps. They were base security at secret bases. So like they were security, counterintelligence corps, base security at the base where they were testing the Norden bomb site during World War II. The second biggest secret of the war was the Norden bomb site. Well, the Nazis got a hold of, they start shooting down German bombers, and they got components in their bomb sites that looked like they came straight out of the Norden bomb site. So they launch an investigation, and they bust an organization called the Duquesne spy ring. There's a movie about this called The House on 52nd Street. I think it's called House on 52nd Street. They actually use FBI surveillance video film from the case in the movie. It's a very good movie. It's based on a true story. Well, Sam Carr and his wife are responsible for security at that base. Apparently the spy ring operated at the factory. So Sam and Frances are kind of off the hook for this. But when the war's over, they realize there were the second generation Norden bomb sites. Some of those technologies are showing up in German bomb sites made by Bausch and Lomb and by Zeiss camera company, who makes lenses for Corona, Perkin-Elmer. Okay.
I mean,
it's all one circle. It's all one circle. So, so Sam Carr and his wife, the only other place they could have gotten that information, because they clamped down on security at the Norden factory. The only other place spies could have possibly been operating is at that airbase where Sam and Frances worked. Well, the funny thing is, when the Rosenbergs get busted, you know who the FBI hauls in for questioning? Sam Carr and his sister Julia.
Wow.
Who marries a guy who might be connected to the Lindbergh kidnapping case. So after all this is done, suddenly Sam and Frances are transferred to Rome, New York. That's the Air Force base where Colonel Schwarzkopf, the father of Norman Schwarzkopf, Colonel Schwarzkopf was the head. Well, Colonel Schwarzkopf was the head of the New Jersey State Police, who investigated the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, let Charles Lindbergh run it, and as soon as the Hauptmann trial was over, he got on a plane and flew to Iran and created the SAVAK secret police, the notorious SAVAK secret police for the Shah of Iran. Well, they did their joint training with U.S. Air Force intelligence. People don't understand the most evil intelligence operation we have is the U.S. Air Force. It's not the CIA. It's the Air Force. You've heard of Gitmo. The Air Force has a black jail. The Air Force has a black jail you've never heard of. And if I knew any more about it, and if I told you any more about it, I'd be in it.
Where is it? Can you say that? Where is it?
No.
Stateside?
But I can tell you this, and this is official records. The U.S. Air Force Security Police and the SAVAK Security Police, they did joint training together at the Air Force Base in Rome, New York, studying enhanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding together. And that's when Sam and his wife were stationed at Rome, New York. So when I say these cases are actually linked together, and they are actually linked together through espionage and all this other
Someone
crap.
was asking me how you tie them all in, so there you have it.
It's going to take a few years of episodes, and you're going to be a big help.
That's a bird's eye view, because I know a lot about them individually, but tying them in is a separate deal.
So now you're telling me, what was it you said about Paul Avery's uncle or grandfather or something?
Well, his biological father was in the Navy, of course. So was his biological father was in the Navy. Paul Stewart Depew was his biological father. His stepfather was Howard Malcolm Avery, also Navy, and worked at the pretty high up the food chain in the Navy, working with munitions and weapons and this kind of thing.
Well, there you go.
Outside of Bakersfield, that's how how Paul winds up driving an hour to Bakersfield Junior College at the same time as Don Chaney, 1952.
See, when you found that link, and then it's so Betty Lou Jensen's father, Colonel Jensen, when Vern Jensen was in the Army, no, he was Army.
Navy. He was Navy. Well, at least at the end of his career, he was Navy, for sure. He was a naval pilot, just like Arthur Lee Allen's father.
Vern Jensen was chemical warfare in the Army, and that's how he got the job at PG&E. You're probably thinking of some other. No,
Vern Jensen, sure was Navy. I think he was a pilot for a while.
Let me double check.
And one thing I could never figure out about Vern, there was a Vern Jensen that lived in Bakersfield before they moved to the Vallejo area. I know he's buried.
There's some Jensens. The lady on the documentary that talked about she saw the killer at Lake Berryessa, she's a Jensen.
She's talk about that. Yeah, she is a Jensen. She's a Jensen. And when I first saw her, I thought maybe that was a Betty Lou's sister, but I know Betty Lou Jensen's sister, her maiden name is, her written out last name now is Long. Melody Long is her sister now, and she has a niece through Melody, but she only had one sister, and her name is Melody Long. But you're right, that lady on the documentary, her name is Jensen as well, but I think no relation. But I'm glad you brought that up.
Because he was working for PG&E. He was in charge of their pipelines because the military. Well, no. Now he was in the Army, but when he worked at PG&E, he was liaison with the Navy. Fueling up. Maybe that was it.
I think he's buried in Vallejo.
Right. So he was the guy in charge of the pipeline. So like when they would need to fill up a tanker with a chemical weapon like napalm, there has to be a guy with the right security clearance, because you want to make sure that doesn't get sabotaged. So he was in charge of that stuff for the Navy in San Francisco Harbor, but he got that experience in the Army working chemical weapons, and that was primarily napalm. He was an expert on napalm. So, but see, the funny thing is, when you have the Golden State Killer, which is tied up with the Visalia Ransacker case, what's interesting is Paul Stein was a cub reporter at the Exeter newspaper.
Right, where D'Angelo was from that area.
And and Paul Stein was childhood friends, high school classmates with one of the guys that the Golden State Killer tried to frame, Oscar Clifton.
Yeah, I remember that was one of the best ties that people that try to make Joe D'Angelo, the Zodiac Killer, play heavily on the fact that he was kind of in and around the area where Paul Stein was from.
Was Paul Stein murdered because of what he knew about that case? Because when he went to San Francisco State University,
he was murdered before Iran's ever happened. Though he was murdered before.
Except for one thing, the Visalia Ransacker became active in early as 62 or 63.
Oh, okay.
And Oscar Clifton, a good friend of Paul Stein's, is framed for being the Golden State Killer. And on top of all of that, When Paul Stein goes to San Francisco State University and he's paying for his tuition by being a teaching assistant, teaching freshman English, you know who one of the students was in maybe he wasn't in Paul Stein's class, maybe not. But he was going
world.
He was a freshman at San Francisco State University taking freshman composition class, and his name, off the top of my head, I don't remember, Sherry Jo Bates's new fiance.
Oh, that's right.
He might have been a student.
Ross was on earlier. I know Ross knows that. I can't remember the name. Ross would right off the top.
He had a football scholarship. He was the new that she probably got killed over. But the funny thing is, Jim was in town, and his brother worked with Sherry Jo Bates's father. So now I only bring it up because the Visalia Ransacker might not have been the Golden State Killer, or because there was a similar case a few years later. This was in right around 69. Anyway, the county north of Napa, they had a very bizarre murder. Local newspaper publisher, very close friend of House Snook's.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Snook because somebody was asking in the chat earlier how is there any way Snook comes into the orbit of Crabtree?
Well, that's very interesting. I had one source tell me that they were friends. I had another story. Here's the long story short about Hal Snook. Hal Snook is the guy who wrote the original, at least the first couple Zodiac killer letters. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, but Snook on the left, and then I got a picture of Tosky with the voyeur.
There you go. So he's got. When you look at, supposedly the Zodiac killer, he was military, he was a super soldier, he was a spook, he had code training, he blah, 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 blah. Hal Snook was all of those things and more. His military record, his academic record, he was like Jim, going around either starting up little newspapers or basically getting old little small town newspapers
Dennis Highland down. Thanks, Joey. Yeah. Dennis Highland was the was her fiance. So thanks, Joey. Yeah, Dennis Highland.
Thanks, Joey. That's good.
Our recall's getting bad. Getting too old.
So Hal, you look at his curriculum vitae and you're looking at a first round draft pick of the CIA. And as a matter of fact, his college roommate.
Oh, he's a sharp guy.
Oh, yeah. Well, his college roommate, apparently, they lived with this guy's aunt or whatever, going to San Jose State University, taking the same journalism classes and everything. They knew each other from high school. They didn't go to the same high school, but they played against each other in high school sports. Their families knew each other. His name is Anthony Poshepny, Tony Poe. And that's interesting because Tony Poe was infamous for throwing a fit if he didn't get his San Francisco Chronicle delivered to him in country in the jungles of Laos in Cambodia. And so he saw the cryptogram on the front page of the Chronicle, and he saw the solution to the cryptogram. And supposedly the 408 cryptogram goes on and on and on about this cult. The infidels I have killed will become my slaves in paradise. That is an actual warrior cult on the Mindanao Islands of the Philippines where Hal Snook trained those guys, the Moros, the Tad-Tads. He trained them in crypto. He trained them in battlefield chemistry like serous oxalate. He trained them in how to build roadside bombs, which were that bomb that's in that Zodiac letter was invented by Colonel Wendell Fertig in the guerrilla warfare campaign That's right. Wendell Fertig invented that bomb. And Hal Snook served under him in the Philippine Scouts, training Filipinos to go back behind the lines. So he knew all about that cult. Hal knew all about that cult. So Anthony Poshepny, who knew all about that cult from talking to Hal Snook when they were in college together and thinking about joining the CIA together, apparently it was Hal who talked him into joining the CIA. When he's reading his San Francisco Chronicle and there's some kind of serial killer terrorist in San Francisco who belongs to this cult, there's no way Tony Poe didn't recognize all of that. No way. And a couple of years later, the Zebra murders, it's the same cult.
I remember
they belong to the same cult. But Hal Snook doesn't say anything. Hal Snook has personal knowledge of this cult from fighting in the jungles of Mindanao and New Guinea before that. And he doesn't say anything. Hey, I think I recognize. Not only that, But the Zodiac cryptograms, those weird symbols that he uses, most of the weird ones come from not just the Cebuano alphabet from the Philippines, but a very specific dialect of Cebuano called Iskaya, the Iskaya people, and there's a little island called Iskaya. That was the island that Snook's company would have landed on when they arrived in Mindanao. That's where he got all the symbols for the cryptograms. And he's looking at this stuff in the newspaper, and he even investigated one of the Zodiac murders, and he never mentioned to anybody that he recognized that alphabet and recognized that cult. And he never said a word to anybody. And neither did Tony Poe.
He found the footprint at Berryessa.
Oh, all that evidence.
The wing walker. Of course, he had a son in the Air Force at the time, and I know one of his sons.
Well, people don't realize.
Was a West Pointer.
Here's the thing people don't realize. According to Graysmith, that was a very rare shoe. In real life, that was by far, it was by far, by a factor of 5 to 1, the most popular uniform shoe sold in America. Military.
Yeah, the Avon sole on the wing walker. Yeah, there was. Yeah, it wasn't that rare. No, that's true. It was not that rare of a shoe. Of course, he tried to claim Arthur Allen owned a pair, which was.
He probably did. He probably did. Everybody owned a pair.
Yeah, they were more common, but I don't think Allen ever wore it. And I've never seen proof that Allen even wore a 10.5. But
right, exactly.
I don't think Allen owned any wing walkers. I mean, he was in the Navy for a year.
And it wasn't just military. They sold it to the military as wing walkers. They sold it to cops as academy. They sold it to janitors under some other. It was the most popular non-skid work shoe.
Yeah, an Avon sole. The sole was Avon, made by Avon.
Yeah, Avon Acorn or something, and then there were several. Basically, so anyway, the company that made the complete wingwalker shoe, they made millions, and it was by far the biggest. Half the deputies in Napa were wearing those shoes. It meant nothing. But speaking of which, the footprints don't go anywhere near where that other car was supposedly parked that Miss Jensen didn't see there anyway. So I'm telling you, the killer didn't park there. Read the book for that stuff. So coming back to all of that, I lost my train of thought. There's so much. There's so much you people don't know.
Since Cat Daddy's bringing this up so many times now on the chat,
sure.
What about Lake Herman Road being a body dump? Because I've never heard of that.
Yeah, there were several cops told us on camera, and they told me years before that even started doing the documentary, that they had found over a dozen bodies in that. See, that's not a parking lot.
You heard that when you were doing the documentary?
Did you go out there?
Yeah, I was out there with them, but I went by myself. Yeah, by myself.
That's not a parking lot. That's barely a wide
it's a turnout.
Spot in this. You can barely get off of the pavement.
Oh, it's very
before
small.
You hit the gate. Yeah,
it's very small.
That entrance. So,
where does the gate go? The gate's still there, but it was like, what's if you go through the gate, go down that road, what does it go to? I forget. It's like
I'm glad you brought that
back
up.
In the day. It was like a power plant or something, or I don't remember.
That's where they were building that refinery. That's where they were building that refinery that was under construction. That's where that road goes. And it eventually goes down and connects to the other highway that runs between Vallejo and Benicia. Yeah, there's those two highways, and that. So only deputies, only law enforcement people. And remember, it wasn't one combination lock. There's like 10 combination locks on every one of those gates, right?
I don't remember the locks, but they were locked.
Oh yeah, there's 10.
They've been there forever,
and they have been. Well, the only people in '69 who had those combinations were law enforcement people. Here's the funny thing about Lake Herman Road, if the car that the witness saw. If the car that Owen saw parked next to the victim's car, and he heard a gunshot, he went down the road. If that's the killer's car, the funny thing is, where did it go? Because there are witnesses coming. That's a road that like there's no turnoffs. So if that's the killer, or even if it wasn't the killer, where did that guy go? There are witnesses coming from both directions. That one of them should have met that car, and they didn't meet any cars. So where'd that car go? The only place.
You think the car went past the gate?
Well, he either flew away or he drove in the gate. Now, here's the funny thing. At the south end of that dirt road, where it meets the highway, on the intersection, one of the houses on the corner, that was Ben, and still is, Ben Villarreal's house. Ben Villarreal was the undercover narcotics cop working for the sheriff's department, who drove past the Blue Rock Springs parking lot. He saw Hoffman's car there, the blue Ford, but he claimed he didn't see Darlene's car there. That was Ben Villarreal. And there's this
Blue Rock Springs.
And people don't know. I don't think I put it in the book. At Blue Rock Springs Park. Well, the reason I bring it up is there was a suspect who was arrested and booked for Darlene's murder, and he apparently had the murder weapon in his pocket when they picked him up.
You had a 9mm?
But he was released. 9mm, the actual one, the one that was broken, the one that would jam. Said he was holding it for a friend. And he was the same guy who had bought the ammunition he said he was holding a gun for a friend. I interviewed that guy. He wouldn't tell me who the friend was, but he said he didn't shoot Darlene. Blah, 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 blah.
Several of us. Crabtree? Did you ask if he knew Crabtree?
I might have. I know the guy didn't shoot Darlene. I know he was set up. He was set up to be arrested with that gun in his pocket. I know that. But the point is, the guy who busted him, the cop who busted him, was Ben Villarreal. Because Ben Villarreal had John Doe Watt's house staked out. He and Hoffman had John Doe Watt's house staked out. If they're staking out John Doe Watt, what are they doing at Blue Rock Springs Park, both driving past Blue Rock Springs Park together at midnight? What are they doing there if they're not there to meet John? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's kind of, and then it gets into how Hoffman, his whole behavior is so suspicious the whole night.
Right. Of course, his grandson has come forward. He was a bad guy. He I never knew him, but he beat me nightly or whatever.
Well, the funny thing is, what people don't realize is, and I'm going to talk about this real soon. We didn't talk about it on the documentary. Hoffman is the guy who proves that the letters are a hoax, because the reporter at the Chronicle who wrote the first story about the shooting. Let me bring this up on my thing. No, monitor 2. Here we go. Let me get on the slide here. This article here that appeared in the Chronicle with no byline. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Woman slain, friend shot. July 6th, 1969. This newspaper report, unsurprisingly,
day later,
comes straight out of Hoffman's report, because Hoffman was the only cop, the only Vallejo cop who typed his report that night. All the other cops were ordered to type their reports July 8th before they went out on strike. So this report, this newspaper article, which is full of mistakes, because Hoffman didn't investigate the whole crime, he just, before he went home, early morning, July 5th, he typed up his report and left. Well, the reporter for the Chronicle has a copy of this report. This is where he gets all the information from. Either he got it from Hoffman, or more likely, Vallejo had their own star investigative reporter named Dave Peterson, who probably got this. The thing is, those first two Zodiac letters, who claim from the killer, he knows things that the killer couldn't possibly have known, including some wrong information, like what's in this article. So we know that a reporter from the Chronicle and the Zodiac letter writer, they both have a copy of Hoffman's report. How is this possible?
So you think Hoffman leaked it to him, or?
Number one, it could have been Hoffman, but see, the funny thing is, Hoffman was still working undercover narcotics. He wasn't
right. He was Hoffman was a plainclothes guy.
Yeah, he wasn't from Vallejo. He wasn't from Vallejo, and that's typical.
He didn't live in Vallejo, right? Like I think he was a Bay Area. Maybe he lived in the Bay Area, but he was plainclothes, I guess, detective. He drove an unmarked car, right?
Yeah, when you're a young rookie cop, you start off working juvenile narcotics because nobody knows you.
He didn't wear a police uniform,
right? Because nobody knows you, right? Because nobody knows you, right? So the second Zodiac letter, he says, contrary to what the police and newspapers are saying, I did not leave the scene of the crime spinning my wheels and racing my engine. Well, all the witnesses said he did, including Mike Michaud. Right. So one of the things when
the neighbors heard it too, I think the neighbors heard it as well.
Right. One of the very first things that I looked at when I first got access to the files was, because Zodiac is telling Dear Editor, he's not writing to the police, he writes to the newspaper. He says, the police will verify what I'm saying. So would the police verify this claim? Were the police aware of a suspect who left the scene of the crime driving slowly and quietly? And the answer was, yeah. Hoffman and Meyering and Lindemann. Meyering and Lindemann were the first two units, radio units, to approach Blue Rock Springs Park when the dispatch went out. They stopped a car leaving Blue Rock Springs Park parking lot, slowly and quietly. This was a car driven by Andy Nicolatis Jr., whose family owned a very interesting liquor store. I'm not saying they're Greek mafia. I'm just saying they owned a very interesting liquor store.
And probably Ross Spinelli.
Hoffman, oh, I'm sure he did. Hoffman was on his way to the crime scene. He stops and he hollers out the window at Meyering and Lindemann because he doesn't have a radio in his car. He says, "Hold on to that guy. I know him. I know that kid. I want to talk to him. Hold him for questioning." So they do. Hoffman proceeds to the crime scene. Well, the funny thing is, Hoffman would claim that he heard the dispatch over his radio, but he didn't have a radio in his car. So how did he hear the dispatch to show up at the crime scene? And he had just been there.
So he lied?
Well, there are things in his report that can't be true. And there are things that he says on the documentary. This is the one about this is Zodiac speaking, whatever, the one that you can see on Fincher's documentary. He says even more things that incriminate himself.
Interestingly, he claims he never knew Darlene Ferrin. Hoffman claims he never knew her. Like, I can't remember the phrase. Somebody in the chat probably does.
Yeah, he keeps changing his story.
Denied knowing her. But Vallejo wasn't that big. It's not that big now. I mean, right. I mean, I know maybe Hoffman's from, not a local, but maybe he never goes to the IHOP for a cup of coffee or the Terry's Waffle House. But I guess it's possible he didn't know her.
As the years go by, but Darlene is hanging out, supposedly hanging out with all the cops in Vallejo and all the undercover cops in Vallejo. And Hoffman is one of the ones who repeats
Buzz
the rumor.
Gordon is one.
Well, but his name was not Buzz Gordon. His name's not Howard Gordon. His name was Gordon Howard. There is a Howard Gordon, but Gordon Howard is the cop who said
I thought it was Buzz Gordon,
Darlene.
which was I think
no,
I don't remember how
that guy told a lot of
Jeff
tales.
Gordon, the NASCAR driver who is from Vallejo.
There was a Howard Gordon who claims to be Buzz Gordon, who claims to be the guy in the reports, but he's not. That's Howard Gordon. The guy interviewed in the police reports was a different rookie Vallejo cop named Gordon Howard. He's the one who said he dated Darlene.
Ah,
people don't understand this.
That's Gordon Howard, not Buzz Gordon.
Right.
Because I think Jeff Gordon does have an uncle named Buzz Howard, and Jeff Gordon, the NASCAR guy, is from Vallejo.
It keeps going back to this bullshit painting party that never happened either. See, those are
right. Let's get to Graysmith. Like we mentioned before, there's a documentary coming out with the Seawaters on Netflix about how they think that their friend is the Zodiac, and Dave Seawater. Most people have seen the videos. Of course, they pulled it down for this documentary coming out. But as I was telling you earlier, they got Graysmith to get involved in this, and I think you said that Andrew tried to get Graysmith to be part of the Myth of the Zodiac, couldn't get him. But apparently these guys got a hold of him, probably because it's a pro-Allen documentary. But it'll be interesting to see what he says. But going back to the painting party, I've always said I don't think it ever happened whatsoever.
No, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The guy that said he was on motorcycle patrol the night Darlene got shot, they don't run motorcycle. Even they
tried to claim that Hoffman was a motorcycle cop, or who did, not to bring in Corky, but like I know Druser said he was in a regular car. I mean, like an unmarked police car, like what they just call a unit, but it wasn't a motorcycle.
Right, his
Hoffman wasn't a car.
No, he was in a blue Ford, right? And Villarreal saw him there, but claimed he didn't. And Hoffman claims he didn't see Darlene's car there. He has to be lying about that. He has to be lying, because they'd been there for 15 minutes when Hoffman said he pulled in the lot and didn't see. And
so that makes him look kind of guilty then,
And a lot of other things make him look guilty. So, but I don't think he was guilty. But it's obvious that Darlene got shot, because I think what happened was, she set up Mike to get shot, and she ends up getting shot because what she doesn't realize is Jim is in on this thing, and Jim matches the description of the shooter. But I think.
So who do you think was the shooter then? It's interesting because we know that the shooter gets out and goes to Mike's side first, which I've always brought that up. I thought that was interesting. Right. We know he gets out of the car from the driver's side and walks over to Mike's side, starts shooting. Through Mike, some of the bullets go through Mike, hit Darlene. But he walks to Mike's side. I always thought that was interesting.
People don't realize, if you look at the police reports themselves and the autopsy reports on Darlene, there is no way that Mike was sitting in the front seat when the shooting started. Mike was already sitting in the back seat when the shooting started. So that
I've never heard that. That's a first.
I've never been able to tell anybody. I'll show people
Okay,
these
that's
things.
news here first on the Zodcast, because we know as the story goes, he's sitting in the front. The radio's on, and we know that Mike shot. Some of the bullets go through, hit Darlene, and then at some point, Mike throws himself in pain. He throws himself in the back seat, and the Zodiac hears him in pain, so he comes back and fires 3 more rounds into Mike to finish him off. But of course, he lives.
There's these long.
But I've never heard that Mike started in the back seat. What would the point? Why would he be in the back seat?
Because somebody else was in the front seat. See, there's this long, complicated.
Really
there's this long, complicated explanation in Mike's stories to the newspaper and in Zodiac letters. There are these long, complicated stories. One of them is about the suspect who left the scene quietly. That was Andy Nicolaus Jr. Now, here's the funny thing: the killer had been gone. The killer had been gone for 20 minutes. How did he know that Andy had been pulled over? Because this was never mentioned in the papers. They questioned Andy, let him go. The murder weapon was not in his car, and it was not anywhere near the scene, so it could not have been Andy. But maybe he knew something, maybe he didn't. But the report of him being questioned by Hoffman is not in the files. But the funny thing is, both Andy and Richard Hoffman had both been shot a few months earlier, and nobody knew that either. They'd both been shot.
In separate incidents?
Well, it depends on what you mean by separate dates. I don't know if there's... And when people ask, what about this dumping ground out on Lake Herman Road? When the cop told me that, he was saying, we found over a dozen bodies out there. He told me that several years before...
Before the documentary?
Oh, way before. Way before. That they'd found a lot of bodies out there. See, well, there's one newspaper article that does mention
beyond the gate. You mean not at the turnout, but beyond the gate. People would get
no, just right there, just right on the side of the road. Just dump the body, or whatever, like they've been shot in that little parking area. And see, the thing is, maybe I shouldn't say this, but when we were shooting out there, they put a drone up, and by golly, I think they spotted that infamous pink house where there was supposedly a drug bust going on. It is inside the gate. There is a house inside the gate.
Like a residence, or just a little shack,
house, or an old little ranch house, a little bigger than a shotgun shack, a little old ranch house from way back in the day. Well, I don't know if it's still pink, but see, the Hells Angels give their clubhouses code names that it wasn't called the Pink House because it was pink. It's just called the Pink House so that Hells Angels know which clubhouse you're talking about. Pink, yellow, brown. They have all these code names for their clubhouses. And Pierre Bidou swears up and down they were busting a house right around there at that time. I always thought it was the caretaker's house. There's that park. Did you stop at that park?
Yeah.
There is a little park there, very nice little park. And the house is there, the caretaker's house. I thought they were talking about the caretaker's house. But Bidou said, no, it wasn't the caretaker's house. It was some other old abandoned house out there that was actually owned by the city or whatever that they were using, and that was getting busted. And that maybe that was why David and Betty Lou got shot, was because they were helping the police. They were staking the place out or something. Or it doesn't matter. If those guys thought that David and Betty Lou were narking, that would be a motive to get shot, because Darlene was the 10th murder victim in 9 months in Vallejo. And all of this was drug related. All this was drug related.
Were the other ones solved? I mean, at least to the satisfaction of whatever.
Are you kidding me?
You know,
they had Vallejo cops who ended up joining the Hells Angels. And you have to commit a felony to join the Hells Angels, right?
Wow.
And the Hells Angels were running all those narcotics from Humboldt County and from Bodega Bay, coming straight through Napa and Vallejo, straight down the highway to Napa and Vallejo.
So what do you think Hoffman's involvement would have been, if any? Because
if this
he
involves,
lied...
well, Mike was involved he's a petty criminal. So here's the thing.
He robbed
here's
houses,
the thing people don't understand. When you read the police reports.
So was Leo Swinton Jr., right? So was Leo Swinton Jr., of course. I mean, her brother.
The third,
right.
Yeah, Leo the third. So here's the funny thing. Mike eventually will tell the cops that he reached out and opened the passenger door using the outside handle. But according to the reports, those aren't Mike's fingerprints on that door handle. Somebody else was sitting in somebody opened that door after Mike got in the car and before the cops showed up.
And it wasn't the shooter.
Why wouldn't it be the shooter? Why not be the shooter? The cops thought it was. They assumed that the fingerprints. No. Well, here's the thing. So when you look at the others, Mike was never in the front seat. So who got out of the front seat before the shooting started? Somebody must have got out of the front seat before the shooting started.
Well, we know the shooter got in a car and left a different car, which Michaud originally thought was
there's that. But there's that. Well, it could have been because Jim told police he owned an identical Corvair they couldn't find. But he said he bought another one. He said he owned one. He drops hints that he's guilty all the time. So the thing is, who was sitting in the front seat? Did Darlene drive those guys there for a drug deal and something went wrong? And Darlene didn't realize that actually see what happens in a lot of these, it's like the Son of Sam murders, it's the rest of the Zodiac murders. There's more than one, and Manson, there's actually JFK. There's a lot of people who want somebody dead or at least shot at, because if you're sending a message to the parents, you don't care if the kid dies or not. It's like Carl Gennaro.
Yeah, he didn't care.
Didn't care if they killed him or not. They're just sending a message to his stepdad and his cousin. That's all. It doesn't. Carl doesn't even have to know what's going on. They'll get the message. And so this is what happens here with the Zodiac stuff. Except of course Paul Stein, who it's the one crime where it's Paul Stein and it's David Faraday and maybe Betty Lou Jensen, where the killer really wants to make sure the victim's dead. It seems like it, and it's like Son of Sam. There's a couple of victims. There's it's coup de grace, but the rest of them doesn't care if they die or not. Right. So you have this. So Mike was not. Those are not Mike's fingerprints on the car door. And what's funny is
who do you think they are? Whoever was in the front seat, or the killer, or it's at the same.
Well, this Dave Peterson that I think is the source for the Chronicle article, because the Vallejo News Chronicle did not publish a Sunday edition. So to earn brownie points at the Chronicle, he might have fed him this story because he would have had a copy of Hoffman's report. Because there are other stories about the Vallejo shooting that are word for word taken from police reports, but they're published in the Vallejo Times-Herald.
Right.
And like I said, in those days, it was common practice. Reporters would type cop reports for them, and then they get to keep a copy. Or they would, they knew shorthand, so they would take down witness statements. At San Francisco Police Department, reporters are answering the phones and taking down reports because the cops are so overworked, and they let the reporters do it. It's one hand washes the other. So if Dave Peterson is the source of this Chronicle story based on Hoffman's report, Peterson claimed in an article in the Times-Herald, he said that Mike told the cops that the killer tore open the door, like he walked up to and yanked the car door open. That was the first thing. And Peterson said he was in the parking lot listening to Mike tell the cops all this stuff. Now, the cops are going to withhold a lot of information to weed out phony confessions like the Zodiac killer letters. Why doesn't the Zodiac killer know that he opened the door? Why isn't that one of the secrets that the Zodiac killer knows? That the killer actually opened the door. But beyond that, why would he open the door? Well, beyond that, Mike wasn't sitting in the front seat when the shooting started. He'd already made his way to the back seat when the shooting started. Somebody else was in the front seat. We may never know who, but somebody else was in the front seat who never came forward and talked.
Who may or may not have been the shooter, in your opinion.
Well, when Mike says that he and Darlene went to Ed's to get something to eat, and at the last second they got into Ed's parking lot, then they turned around and drove to the park.
Right.
I think what they did was they picked somebody up at Mr. Ed's and drove to the park. And that's who, and I think they were supposed to meet somebody there, and somebody showed up, and everybody who was still there got shot.
And Mike,
now here's the thing: even if it's just because, let's say Mike and Darlene were in the parking lot, and Hoffman's car, the undercover juvenile narcotics cop, pulls in the parking lot and leaves. Somebody who saw that might have assumed that Darlene was working, or Mike was working with Hoffman. They might have just assumed it. So it doesn't matter if it's true, but anybody who saw that might have assumed that that's what was going on. Because obviously Hoffman and Villarreal went there to bust somebody, and I think what happened was they got there a couple minutes too early and blew the whole thing. That's one easy explanation for it right there. They just got there too early, and the actual drug dealers saw all that and recognized who they were and just shot whoever the hell was in the parking lot at the time.
Yeah, well, it should have just been Mike or
just like David and Betty
killing her
Lou.
while they were at it, which explains why they would have gone to Mike's store in that instance.
Right. And see, like David and Betty Lou, there's an hour of time missing. They're not.
When they left the Christmas concert and went over there.
Well, I don't think they even went to the Christmas concert. Right?
I thought they went to the Christmas concert.
There was no
Hogan.
There was no
Hogan High. The story was that's where they were that night. They went to the one at Hogan.
But there wasn't one. There was
Hogan
no
High
Christmas
School,
concert.
and then they left, and I think they maybe went somewhere to eat, and then they went to Lake Herman Road.
See, I don't remember who, but no, there was no Christmas concert. So other of their friends said, yeah, we were all going to have a party out there at that spot on Lake Herman Road. See, the party might have been in the house. So, and see, the killer might have closed the gate and locked it before he left to throw the cops off. We will never really know what happened. But the thing is, if those guys just assumed David and Betty Lou were narcs, that would explain why they got shot.
Yeah.
So
even if they weren't, they just thought they were good enough and killed them.
So the question is, if all these drug-related shootings are going on, why did Zodiac cherry-pick those two shootings to write the first two letters about? And that answer starts to get very, very... When you find out who Hal Snook is and what he did and what he might be... And then he's not the one writing the letters later on. Somebody else. And I'm telling you, I think it's Paul Avery who's at one point takes over all that stuff... all that literary crap about those long-winded letters. I think Paul Avery wrote those.
The Zodiac letters. Some of the Zodiac letters.
Mm-hmm.
I think he and Graysmith said that before.
See, speaking of the spooky angle, Paul Avery had just started working at the Chronicle around May of '69 at the exact same time Graysmith started working there. And Paul Avery had just got back from Southeast Asia. He started a small startup wire news service covering war news in Vietnam.
Right.
So he could have easily, and see, Graysmith, if he's working, or anybody's working at, not just at the Chronicle, Graysmith worked at the Oakland Tribune before he went to work at the Chronicle, doing the same job. See, people don't even know what his job was. He lied about his job. So if Avery it makes contact with Tony Poe, he's up in Laos, if he made contact with him and he's sending fake news stories back over his wire service that have secret information in them, anybody working at the Chronicle or the Oakland Tribune who knew this, you wouldn't have to use those articles in the paper. You would just have to get them over the teletype and take them home, decode them, do whatever. So if Tony Poe is sending messages back to Hal Snook without the CIA knowing it, he could have been doing it through Paul Avery. And I think the only reason, because when you read the Zodiac Killer letters, he only makes two demands. He demands the 408 be printed on the front page of 3 newspapers, and then later on he supposedly demands the 340 be printed in the newspaper. Well, in the newspaper, it's on their own nickel that they print everything else. Well, what was so important about the 408? Is it a secret message? Why was the code so easy to break?
I think he wanted the 408 solved. That's why he wrote Concerned Citizen.
Well, it gets interesting.
Hardin solved it a little too easy, a little too quickly. Then he sends Concerned Citizen in, which I fully believe Concerned Citizen and Zodiac.
Then why bother encrypting it in the first place?
That's good.
Enciphering it in
point.
The first place. Why bother doing it?
That's a good question. But
now it creates a story for the Chronicle that the other newspapers have to give free publicity to, and the Chronicle were locked in a death struggle with the Examiner because the national news advertising agencies were switching to a new policy. They were only going to place ads in one paper per market, and the Chronicle and the Examiner were fighting it out to the death. And they all have to give free publicity to a story in the Chronicle. The examiner had to print 2 letters from Zodiac, or had to mention 2 letters from Zodiac. So what's the point? What is it about that message? And you read this message, the first one third is just blah, blah, blah. It's repetitive. It's just repetitive.
Yeah.
The middle 1/3 that was printed in the Chronicle, or was guaranteed to be printed in the Chronicle, that's where he mentions the cult. That's where he mentions the cult that Tony Poe knew all about. I think all it was a go code, because if you look at what happened, if you look at what Tony Poe was doing in the summer and fall of 1969, he's in this power struggle with General Vang Pao and some other CIA guys about them manufacturing heroin. They weren't shipping opium out of. They had their own factory making the heroin, and they were sending it back.
Ted Shackley and they
there
knew that.
You go.
They were letting him do that.
There you go. Those same guys. And here's what's going on. So he's blowing the whistle on these guys because he says they're siphoning off most of the money of their own private thing. Well, maybe he doesn't realize what the CIA is in business for. So the story goes, he gets in trouble in November of 69. Like 2 days after the 340 appears in the paper, Tony Poe is slapped around and he's stuck behind a desk in Bangkok, Thailand. That also happened to be the same month when they busted the guy who had been trafficking the heroin, Vang Pao, and then he had a guy in Bangkok on the other end of that. Well, they bust those guys, and you know who took over that month? An Air Force guy named Ike Atkinson, who had a cousin back in the United States named Frank Lucas. And there's Tony Poe, station chief in Bangkok, who just got through supervising that exact same operation at the source, at the farms in Laos. Now he's in Bangkok, and here comes Ike Atkinson and Frank Lucas. I only bring it up because there was a mechanic at that Air Force base named John Charles Carr. And when he was finally, he did he did 6 years in country. When he's rotated home for Christmas 75, whatever it was, a couple weeks after he got home, guess who gets busted? Frank Lucas and Ike Atkinson.
That's a small world.
Now, whether John Carr snitched on them or not doesn't matter. I can guarantee you this. I've known a few people. I can guarantee you this. When they got busted, the first thing they asked themselves was it Sergeant John Carr? Because it turns out that his family had been cooperating with the FBI for years and the CIA for years because their father got caught being a commie spy in the 40s. So all of a sudden, all these unsolvable mysteries, and did you notice that they're not just unsolvable mysteries, but there's this ridiculous 3-ring media circus that goes along with each one of these cases?
Oh, of course.
And it involves phony letters. Remember, there are these phony
DB
Son of
Cooper,
Sam letters.
Yeah,
DB Cooper.
A lot of, at least 5 of them, in my opinion, were fake because they were signed DB Cooper, which of course was not his real name. So the real culprit would have never just jumped on the moniker. So yeah, they were fake letters. Hoaxes.
So Avery's father and stepfather were both Navy officers.
Yep. Paul Avery's father was Paul Stewart Depew, and then his stepfather was Howard Malcolm Avery, who married Paul Avery's biological mother was of the Cannon family. So in Mormonism, you have Brigham Young, you have Joseph Smith, and then you have the Cannon family. If you looked up the name Cannon in Mormonism, very high up hierarchy of one of them brought Mormonism to Hawaiian Islands, which was Avery's, I think, grandfather Cannon on his mother's side. So very high up in Mormon.
Because the thing is, you've heard of the Keddie, California, was this old rundown resort, the Cabin 28 inexplicable murders.
The Keddie Cabin murders, yeah.
The father of that family, James Sharp, was from the same corner of Missouri that the Bell Phillips family, all these Mormons, he's from there too. And he's a Mormon.
Yeah.
And the
Mormon angle is interesting.
The Seabolts next door are Mormons. Well, speaking of Manson, in Hollywood, there's this bizarre, brutal murder of Doreen Gall and James Sharp. Not the same James Sharp, but the Sharp family. He was from that exact same town in Missouri.
Yeah, very small world.
I told you that I was going to throw so much stuff at you that I had never told you before.
Yeah, I never heard of another guy sitting in the car at Blue Rock. You got me. You got me there. That's a new one.
Or was it a girl?
Oh yeah, a person.
I think here's what's funny. Darlene's sister, she'd been with her sister Christina all day long. Supposedly, she dropped off Christina at their parents' house, and see that she's a little separate from the rest of the family. Supposedly,
She had
Darlene,
three sisters, right? It was Pam,
supposedly,
Linda.
well, she had a bunch. They had 10 kids. She had 9 brothers and sisters.
Wow, yeah, and it was Leo the third. Yeah. Pam, of course, Pam spoke the most. Pam Huckabee.
Well, it's a funny family. So, supposedly, she drops off Christina at their parents' house and goes and picks up Mike and goes to Blue Rock Springs and gets shot. But I think Christina was in the car. I think there were arrangements, something about meeting Christina at the park, and something went south. And Christina made it out. They got Christina out of the car. It might not have been Christina, and I don't want to throw shade at Christina. But or it might have been, it wasn't Pam because she had an alibi. But Darlene and Linda was a criminal. Linda Del Bono was a criminal.
Linda was in jail. Like, I guess they retell that during
but
Zodiac
see, the
movie.
When they talk about the Lee that was sending presents to Darlene from Mexico, that wasn't a man.
They try to make that Arthur Lee Allen, of course.
That wasn't a man. That was a woman named Lee Proctor, Linda's friend. From Texas, Linda Proctor would send gifts back to Vallejo for the Suenin family. Not Arthur Lee Allen, Lee Proctor.
Yeah.
And the guy, I'm going to throw a couple more out here. The guy that was the babysitter saw sitting outside the Farron apartment.
Yeah, the babysitter was a woman, but we know
house,
that.
Right. Well, she didn't know. That was the neighbor.
No, she didn't know.
That was Richard Moncour. That was his parking spot. If you look at that little house, there's an alley between, and his parking spot is literally like his headlights would be like 6 inches from their living room window. But that was Richard Moncour. You people out there in viewerland, you don't know anything about this case. You must read this book, The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Then watch.
You were one of the first people that read all the files, so it's interesting. I was the first person. Hoffman,
I was the first person
that got access, right? Or
I was the first person to sort them. Voight and Butterfingers and other people. Well, because I'm going to throw a shout out to Mike Rodelli. Mike Rodelli spent, I don't know how much money.
I knew Rodelli had a part of that.
This was a landmark FOIA case. So he got those files, and then Voight and Butterfingers stabbed him in the back. And I can't believe Butterfingers had the gall to show up on my show. But it's okay.
Did you know?
I noticed that he stole. Did you notice?
I didn't know.
He
stole
something from my book. He stole something from my book.
I had no idea. I had no idea who was going to be doing what.
He's sitting there. He's sitting there saying I'm full of shit, and he's copying out of my book. So anyway, the thing is, so they double crossed Rodelli. Okay, now Rodelli's suspect is interesting.
I don't know Mike, but he seems like a good guy. God help him. Kowali's a hard sell, but he's a damn good researcher.
Well, if it wasn't for him, and he spent a lot, like 6 figures on this case to get the documents that we all got. So, but see, Voight hid some, Butterfingers.
Sorry, I'm behind on goat screams. Since you said it 3 times, I got to do three screams. Okay, we're caught up, Jen.
So
I get penalized.
Have I confused people enough? So here's the thing. Now you and I are going to start talking about stuff online now on a regular basis, because I know I'm throwing stuff at people they've never heard, because all they've ever heard is the myth. It's not their fault that they don't know anything, but if you're interested in Zodiac, you don't know anything about it. I know there's so much,
many, especially when the Darlene Ferrin world. It's unfortunately a rabbit hole, is what we call it.
That's a big one.
It's just so many. Yeah, she's got a big family, like you said. There was the phone calls that were made after Blue Rock Springs and her murder. There was the people calling, and
that was actually 2 phone calls.
Leo the third, or what? Okay, what was the deal with the phone calls?
There
And
are
then
two
who do you
phone
think?
calls.
And then also onto that, who do you think made the phone call after Blue Rock Springs?
Well, there are two phone calls. We
Not to
know
the
from the
Swinens, but
reports.
one to the VPD. Two.
No, two to Nancy Slover at VPD. By the time she was asked to type her report, I think she honestly conflated the two calls, because there were two calls made. There was one, a short prank call, and they were plagued by these prank calls.
Right.
That just repeated information that they heard over police dispatch radio. You don't need a scanner for that. You need a scanner to pick up the individual channels of each individual radio unit. But the dispatcher is on one big channel. And you only need, there are all kinds of radios you could buy at electronic. Radio Shack sold a radio that had police band on it. So
Right.
The kid who took the pictures, he turned out to be interesting. The kid who took the pictures for the papers at Lake Herman Road, he had one of those radios in his car. That's how he heard the dispatch. That's how he knew to go out there. So one person made a prank call, but at the almost the exact same moment, the three kids who arrived at the crime scene, saw Mike on the ground, saw what's going on, they went to Jerry's house on Castlewood. That's about 10 minutes away. And they called the police. Deborah thought that Nancy didn't believe her. But she didn't understand was Nancy was busy and all this stuff was going on. So she thought that Nancy didn't believe her. So they drove to her brother-in-law's, her sister's house. They didn't have a telephone yet. In those days, we didn't have a phone when I was a kid. Telephone's expensive. Rookie cops didn't make any money, and the wife didn't work. They drove to her sister's house because her brother-in-law was a rookie cop.
Yeah, they go to a phone.
And told him. So he drove to a payphone to call VPD to make sure they're rolling on the call. When you read that second phone call, it's in the third person because he's just reading the information that his sister gave him. And I think Nancy Slover conflated those two phone calls.
Okay.
But, well, we may never know that. But there's nothing in that phone call that indicates it was the killer. It clearly indicates somebody was listening. If you drive 1 mile east, you'll come to the crime scene. Vallejo Police Department is 4 miles southwest. But 1 mile west of the crime scene was a brand new fire station, ambulance station being built because the college is being built there. They built a new fire station, and the dispatcher's instructions: drive 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the parking lot of the.
Yeah. And so some people thought he wasn't a local, but blah, blah,
Right. So
the directions were a little.
Same thing about Napa. Now here's where it gets interesting.
Right.
About Lake Berryessa. If you are working at the Oakland Tribune, like Robert Graysmith did, and we know he would hang around, those were union shops. He could never get a byline. But he'd been a sports desk reporter when he was a kid. He wanted to be a true crime reporter, like his hero, his good friend Bob Pop, who worked the Oakland Tribune, who worked the Oakland Police Department beat for the Chronicle. That's where he met Bob Pop. He lies about Bob Pop in his book, but Bob Pop was working Oakland PD. So he'd hang out with Bob Pop and listen to the police band radios that they had at the Oakland Tribune. If you take the first dispatch to Blue Rock Springs Park and you run down the stairs and you get in your car and it's late at night, so you drive 80 miles per hour, you can arrive at that. See, the phone booth where the call was made is not the phone booth that Graysmith talks about in his book. It's a phone booth.
Springs is another one. I forgot the name of the business at the time.
It's north of the sheriff's office. It's a phone booth that's north of the sheriff's office. See, they had no way to trace calls in those days. The computerized switching equipment was not installed in Vallejo until the mid-70s.
Somebody told me that Hoffman could have been at the hospital and just gave Slover, or whoever picked up for Slover at VPD, could have just said, "Hey, I'm calling from this number," and gave her the phone number for the phone that was at Tuolumne and Springs. And he could have been at the hospital and just told her that. But they had to the phone got a ring back, right? The one at Tuolumne and Springs got a ring back.
No.
That's what I thought.
That's all lies. That's lies. See, Graysmith starts using the letters as a source. That's a story that Zodiac tells in a letter that isn't true. I think what might have happened was he might have been
the shabbily dressed Negro man, or that whole thing. That was maybe trying to legitimize it.
when we know Hoffman called the police department from the hospital when he left the hospital, we know that. He put that in his report. He called.
Right.
So when they dispatched the coroner's deputy to take care, well, actually, Dan Horan was on duty that night. It was a weekend night, and he knew it would be a busy night. When they dispatched the coroner to come take charge of the body, he would have driven past the phone booth where the call was being made. My question is, did he stop and make the phone call? Or was Zodiac playing around, you drove right past me? But that was where the phone booth was. The phone booth was between the police department and the hospital, straight up the road. That was where because in those days, what the cops had to do was call the phone company and, hey, ask all the operators, hey, who took the phone call about the shooting at Blue Rock Springs Park? Did they say where they were calling from? The only thing the operators would know is the call came in because all the payphones had their own exchange number. She only knew it was a payphone, and she may have asked him what payphone.
Yeah, it's not going to show her that this is the payphone at Tuolumne and Springs,
Right.
or
They wouldn't
the
get
payphone at Kaiser Hospital.
They didn't get that. They didn't get that technology till the mid-'70s. So that's in one of the phone books, 75, 76, something like that. So anyway, the phone call there. If you get in your car from the Oakland Tribune and you drive 80 miles an hour to that phone booth, that's what time the phone call came in. And if you are sitting in the same Oakland Tribune building, because they have this really tall radio mast. See, if you, it's all hills, but the reason that highway runs through Vallejo and Napa is because it's a valley that runs through there. Radio signals can travel from Napa to Oakland. There's no mountains there. Especially if you have a tall mast like the Oakland Tribune had, monitoring all police, all everything. If you hear that dispatch to send an ambulance and deputies to Lake Berryessa, if you go downstairs and jump in your car and you drive 80 miles an hour to that phone booth in Napa, that's exactly what time that phone call was made. But I don't think it could have been Graysmith. It could have been Graysmith making both of those phone calls. It is possible he could drive from the Oakland Tribune to both of those. That's exactly how long it would take to get to that phone booth. But I don't think he did, because there was a very sleazy reporter who was living in Napa. In fact, he and his business partner got their knuckles wrapped for printing fake conspiracy theories about Napa police. And he had this very shady friend who had just moved there, a con art and a brilliant musician who turns out to be a link between Hal Snook and I'm getting too far off the topic. So the point is, there's this very sleazy reporter at KVON radio station in Napa, and he said he had guessed which phone booth it was, and he was already there when the cops arrived. And then later on, Hal Snook arrived to process the prints and everything from the phone booth.
In Napa, you're talking about now.
In Napa, this reporter.
Right, at the car wash.
I talked to this guy, and I recorded his voice, which I can't broadcast. But when Nancy Slover described the voice of Zodiac, and it had it was a deep voice.
Goodbye, something like that. Yeah. Ned does it better than I can. had
kind of a slow talking, more of a baritone.
Yeah, like she said, she thought he was rehearsed. Like he had.
Well, here's the thing. She said that she heard a tape of Gaikowski and said, "Boy, that really sounds like that guy." Right.
Right. She also said the actor that played Arthur Lee Allen in the movie sounded just like it as well. So Nancy.
Well, but here's the thing.
Taking one too many trips on the Zodiac party bus.
Here's the thing. This reporter from KVON, his voice sounds exactly like Gaikowski. Yep. And it has that flinty quality. Has a baritone voice, but you have these little sparkles of the vocal cord kind of cracks a little bit. That's exactly what he sounds like. To this day, that's what he sounds like. And when I talked to him, I was talking to him about this musician friend of his. And he got super suspicious. He knew exactly why I was calling. I mean, I've never heard anybody so cagey in my life. An old man be so cagey over the phone, talking about the music industry and not anything to do with Zodiac, and being that cagey. And he sounds exactly, there's no tape of the Lake Berryessa color, and that's a shame
No,
because I'm telling
no.
you, this guy
Or
and this
that color,
guy,
or the Blue Rock color either. That's why
and
they
he
would
was
have.
there. He was there. He was there at the correct phone booth before the cops were. There's no doubt about that. He could have made that phone call. And again, it's just information that was coming over from the dispatcher, and it was not from being at the scene of the crime. And the police were flooded with these crank calls. It was a constant problem. So,
Yeah, they weren't expecting him. That's why when Slover took the call, she was trying to question him and retain what she was being told, which was really hard. Even she did have some training, by the way, but it's hard when she's trying to question him.
You know who trained her? You know who? Well, you know who trained
Napa.
You know who trained David Slate in Napa? David Slate took the prank phone call. Hal Snook did train David Slate.
More sense as he was out of Napa, right?
Hal Snook's first job was he created the radio dispatch office at Napa Police Department. They didn't have one. So a full-time dispatch, or more or less a deputy typist who answers the phone, he trained David Slate. And I think he trained Nancy Slover. Because he trained a lot of cops. He trained a lot of cops in narcotics investigation. He was a teacher at Napa Valley Junior College. He taught criminal justice there. So anyway, there's this friend of his, a newspaper publisher in Lake County, which is just north of Napa County. And he's the guy who taught Hal Snook how to do rock polishing and gem polishing using, and what you use for that is a chemical called serous oxalate, which Hal would have known,
in the letter.
which Hal would have used as anti-air sickness paratrooper before. This was before Dramamine was discovered, and was also used by spies as invisible ink.
Speaking of Snook, though, real quick, is they never even said Hal Snook in the documentary. Was that something they wanted to keep out, or I didn't even think of that till after watching it. I was like, we didn't even bring up Hal Snook, which is such a big part of your
well, I think they wanted to avoid accusing people who weren't around to speak for themselves.
Right.
I think that
obviously he was deceased, but I know
he can't speak for himself. Well, I contacted his son and said, I just said something about I'm writing a book about. I didn't say it was about Zodiac or anything. I want to talk to him about his dad. And he deleted his Facebook. He deleted his phone number and everything. I never got a response. They won't talk about him. I could not find a cop who was willing to talk about Hal at all. I could not find. They either said they didn't know him, or they said, you know what? He never talked to anybody. He came in his lab and did his job and left and never talked to anybody. So I couldn't find anybody to talk about him. But one nephew said, I saw a photograph of Hal. I said, did he ever tell you what he did during the war? And he said, no, he never talked about it. I said, he trained these guerrillas to go behind the lines. I don't think Hal ever. Well, he did go behind the lines. He was a construction. He was a combat engineer. So planting roadside bombs and things, right? And rebuilding bridges. So anyway, the nephew said, I saw a picture of Hal. He told me it was in the Philippines and it was at a sawmill. It was because that's what the combat engineers would do. They got in the jungle, cut down trees and use them to build bridges. So he didn't know anything else about his own uncle or what he did during the war. Now, here's a couple other things I want to tell you real quick. So there's this newspaper publisher who lives up north of Napa. In 63-ish, his daughter, who was a very famous feature writer at the New Yorker magazine, and whose husband had just gotten a job as a professor at Stanford University, they get divorced. So she moves back to Napa, where her parents live now. They've moved to Napa. And when I say newspaper publisher, in those days, the little newspapers that Hal took over when he got out of college with his journalism degree, like Jim Crabtree would do a few years later, when he's doing this, in order to get a photograph published, to process a photograph so he can print it in his newspaper, he has to send it to what's called a service bureau. I used to work for a service bureau about 50 years ago. I know everything about Graysmith's job at the Chronicle. And the Chronicle was the most common. The Chronicle was really the only service bureau that those newspapers north of the Bay Area would have to send their photographs and have processed and have the film or whatever come back so they could use it in their newspaper. So this friend of Hal's starts a service bureau, probably at Hal's suggestion, for all the local newspapers in the area. So Hal really knows this guy, and he's familiar with the Chronicle, and he's familiar with whoever, before Robert Graysmith went from the Tribune to the Chronicle, the guy who did that job before Robert Graysmith, Hal Snook knew very well. So did Hal Snook know Robert Graysmith? It's kind of funny that they don't know each other. It's really weird because their paths cross. One of the big secrets about Graysmith's life, he talks about being stationed in Japan after World War II because his dad was stationed there. He never talks about what his dad did right before they arrived in Japan, because that was the period of time when Hal was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base. And I just wonder if Robert, but here's the funny thing. When the Graysmiths, it's not Graysmith, that's not his real name.
It's
when
Graysmith.
Right, when it's his father, Colonel Robert Smith Sr.
Right.
When they're stationed at Tachikawa Air Force Base, two interesting things there. One is that Robert Graysmith is a Boy Scout, and the Tachikawa Boy Scout campground there, they had a terrible pedophile problem. The second thing is, Bobby was like 12 years old. He got a job at the Tachikawa Marauder newspaper, which was the biggest newspaper of the entire Stars and Stripes newspaper chain in the Pacific at that time. He got a job there doing graphics, working in the dark room, making the printing plates, and he would cover the sports desk when the sports editor was away. He's 12 years old, and he's practically running the Tachikawa Marauder. How did he learn how to do all those jobs? Somebody had to teach him, and his father was not a newspaper man. His father was it was all about... His father was qualified to work at Walmart. His a manager, like he knew all about logistics. His father was a logistics officer, not newspaper, not journalism. How did Robert Graysmith get that job? Somebody must have taught him all those jobs. And one person who could have taught him all those jobs, who knew how to do everything in a newspaper, was Hal Snook, who happened to be stationed at Lowry Air Force Base during the period of time, whatever posting Colonel Smith had that Robert won't talk about. I wonder if it was Lowry Air Force Base, because Hal Snook
get his record. Get a colonel. It's a colonel, right? His father was a colonel.
I don't know when he.
I know he died in Florida.
Because you got to wait 69 years after they leave the service, so I don't know exactly when his father retired. Because I can get Sam Carr's, or is it 59 years? I can get Sam Carr's DD-214. I just haven't got it yet. There's a lot of hoops you got to jump through.
Yeah.
But we and also a lot of them got destroyed in the fire of 73 at the archives.
A lot, yeah.
But I couldn't believe how
the woods, right? Wasn't that in St. Louis?
And Andrew or Evan from Texas, the old
Yes, I was going to ask about. I'm glad you brought him up because I didn't want to let you go without. Have you heard from him lately?
He's like, I've got a job now. Please leave me alone.
Yeah,
but
he's a great guy, super smart. Like he set out to kind of debunk you, and he wound up going along with your
proving
stuff.
me right.
And
He really proved.
Really, I really like him. He's a
letters
smart
were
guy.
turned up. He's such a nice guy.
He did some really great videos, and really nice guy. I think some people were kind of bugging him or whatever online.
He got Hal's.
He keeps a real low profile,
but he got Hal's DD-214 for us. He got Hal's DD-214 for us.
And he got that picture of Dennis Land too, didn't he? The one, the only picture I've ever seen of Dennis Land, which was
right. Now here's the funny thing.
Oh, that's Bucky Stewart. That one. That's the only picture I've ever seen of Dennis Land. And I had to find mine, get somebody put up on the internet, so it says DrewTube on it because I didn't think anyone else had it. Proof and pudding, they didn't.
So this lady who gets murdered, this lady reporter, she is burning the town down. She is this New York sexually liberated broad. She's writing phony letters to herself and signing them with the names of prominent gentlemen around town. This is a small town. And just writing phony letters to herself, driving people up the wall. Well, her house has been ransacked a couple of times by some strange prowler who breaks in when she's not home, makes it obvious he's going through her stuff. He's going through her underwear drawer. He's going through all this stuff. And he takes some little trivial thing as a souvenir. This sounds like the Visalia Ransacker who was doing the exact
Yeah, that's what I was just
same
gonna, that
thing.
does
And
sounds just like
then
him.
And then he kind of leaves town. He leaves Tulare County, and the Golden State Killer takes over. So some people think he transitioned from being just a prowler to going ahead and becoming a rapist and murderer.
Right.
But there's another explanation,
Panty
because
thief. And
this is the exact same time when the Lake County ransacker begins his career in Lake County, California, north of Napa. And this lady has had her apartment, and a few other people had their apartment ransacked by this house ransacked by this guy. He does exactly what the Visalia Ransacker does. Exactly. His MO is the same. And this lady ends up murdered in a bizarre. She's naked on the bed, laid out like a cross. She's shot in the head twice, once in each breast and once in the groin area. Some kind of ritual shooting. This case has never been cracked. How Snook did the forensics processing, because that's the closest forensic expert that they had was at Napa County. She's the daughter of this newspaper publisher that Hal Snook is very close friends with for many, many years. She's murdered in another bizarre, uncrackable murder that Hal Snook is processing the crime scene for. And the funny thing is, Paul Stein was covering the Visalia Ransacker before he went someplace. Well, it turns out that the Lake County Ransacker was caught and questioned by police, and they cleared him of the murder. You'll never guess what his job was. He was a meter reader for Pacific Gas and Electric. He had been caught ransacking houses.
Wow, kind of sounds like Dennis Rader. BTK.
South of there, he'd been caught doing this. Down south towards Tulare County somewhere, and the company didn't fire him. They transferred him to Lake County, and just like in Tulare County, where ransack turns into bizarre, horrible murder of a woman, they transfer him to Lake County, and the next thing you know, one of the houses he ransacked, the lady who lives there, is murdered in some bizarre, uncrackable sexual murder. Wow. That's a lot of coincidences, especially when Paul Stein happens to know a lot about both the Visalia Ransacker and the Golden State Killer, probably because he's a reporter. And here's the funny thing. When I say that there's a possibility there was somebody sitting in the front seat of Darlene's car before the shooting started, and it might have been a girl, it might have been Christina, it's because those coded messages, it's like, what's the point? What's the point of going? Why would you take the risk of having yourself sent to the gas chamber for first-degree murder, let alone terrorism? Why would you take a risk in doing that? To have these stupid cryptograms printed on the newspaper. That must have been important. Maybe there's a code within the code. So I've done an episode on this. It's on my YouTube channel. There's a code within the code. And there are a lot of messages in there. A lot of them. And a couple of them go like this. I went Blue Rock Springs Park to meet hippie victim's sister or victim's hippie sister. You could go any word order, right?
One of Darlene's sisters.
And the funny thing is, is it David Oranchek or Oranchak?
Ranchak.
Do you know?
Oranchak.
Oranchak.
Yeah.
When he cracked the 340, it's chock full of these little messages too. And his solution to the 340, sometimes you have to play around with word order. So there are all these complete sentences, and a lot of them go like this. I met hippie victim's sister, because Darlene was described as a hippie, right? Because she and Jim, Operation Chaos, are hanging around with the hippies and the hate. I went Blue Rock Springs Park to meet hippie victim's sister. I don't have him memorized. Hippie victim's sister, he'd met her earlier in the day. Darlene had been hanging out with Christina at the boat parade, right? Because Christina was Miss Firecracker.
Mm-hmm.
I went Blue Rock Springs Park to meet hippie victim's sister. Blah, 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 blah. Well, a couple of those messages go like this. This time, now this is the cipher that's printed in August of 1969. August comes before October. Here's the thing about those letters. The letters prove that they're a hoax, because this guy doesn't, if Hal Snook or Paul Avery gets caught, they don't want to go to the gas chamber for framing themselves for murder. Well, some of those sentences go like this. This time I owe Pinecrest victim's shirt. Another one. We tie his Pinecrest. This time I owe Pinecrest victim's shirt. We tie his Pinecrest victim's shirt to me. If there is any evidence of any kind that these letters have anything to do, that the letter writer is directly connected to any of these murders, it's not from the evidence that he plays around with. If he did correctly predict the Paul Stein murder, now all of a sudden this is no longer a prank or a joke. And the funny thing is about Paul Stein's murder is it's totally different from all the other Zodiac murders. Totally different victim profile. Totally different MO. Totally different description of the killer. Totally different city. So, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff, this code within the code. You can make complete sentences, and you can't really make any sentences that don't have anything to do with the murders. But the ones that really caught my attention, this time I owe Pinecrest victims shirt. We tie his Pinecrest victim shirt to me.
Right.
So if that's true, then there must be something special about Paul Stein. Well, one of the things that's special about Paul Stein is he might know a lot about the Golden State Killer and the Visalia Ransacker, who's also apparently the Lake County Ransacker. And two, there are some sentences that go like this. I can't remember the word for word, but it implies that Paul Stein had talked either to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, or he had talked to Darlene and Mike, or maybe he had talked to all four. There are a bunch of sentences about meeting teen victims. So it's a very simple code within the code. It's very, very simple. It doesn't make it true. And just because these sentences make sense doesn't make them true. So the thing about Paul Stein's murder is that's the murder I can link directly to the Manson family. I will show people on my YouTube channel. You have to pay to subscribe. I will show you the mugshots. About for a while. I will show you the mugshots of Paul Stein's killer. And there is no doubt about it. He's even wearing a parka-type jacket. And he was in San Francisco. And he had altered his, like everything. There's no doubt about it. And this guy is as spooky as it gets. This guy makes James Jarrett look like.
So have you already announced that yet, or that's something you're still going to do?
Oh, I'm saving it for this.
You're saving it. Okay.
Yeah. I just had James Jarrett on the brain because I was reading a bunch of stuff. He's what we call a popcorn spook, like Crabtree, like Jeffrey Epstein. Guys who they're a little spooky, but they go around shooting their mouths off about how spooky they are, like a popcorn, like a movie, like a popcorn pimp, a popcorn spook. This is James Jarrett, who did train. He and Marilyn Monroe's first husband, Doherty, they're the ones who trained the first SWAT team in America for the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. But this guy's a real spook. And I think and he makes a solid gold suspect for all of Ross's murders, the Domingos Edwards murders, the honeymoon shooter,
Ray Davis,
the murder of the cab driver,
Swindles,
the murder of the cab driver, the murder of the cab driver,
that was Ray Davis, the murder in Oceanside 62.
Was that him? That was Ray Davis, the cab driver?
Ray Davis was cab driver in Oceanside.
Okay, yeah. That's almost exactly like the Paul Stein murder is like a reenactment of the Ray Davis murder.
That's what we think. That it's that lady that wrote about it that got it on the radar, and then Ross has done a lot on that.
Well, and I did his show. Well, here's the funny thing to catch people up. Here's the funny thing about this. This was a cab driver who was murdered very close to Camp Pendleton. This is important. Oceanside, California. What happened apparently was somehow, some way, the cab driver is shot in the back from the back seat, shot in the head from the back seat. Then the killer or somebody pushed him over on the passenger side and got in the cab and drove it another block or so.
Right, to where the former layer lived, or I can't remember. But yes, it was driven. That's true.
So the funny thing is, in the Zodiac killer letter, the Paul Stein murder, which Evan didn't think Hal Snook wrote that letter, and I'm beginning to think he might have been right. Because Well, for a lot of reasons I'll explain some other time. But the thing about that murder is, in the Zodiac letter, he says, "I'm the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington and Maple Street last night." But the problem is, the car was found at Washington and Cherry, a block further on.
Yeah.
Is
Maybe
this
he
a
drove
clue?
up another block. Yeah.
Well, or is this just a clue that this is connected to that other murder? Because the funny thing is, my suspect for shooting Paul Stein was at Camp Pendleton when Ray Davis got shot. Well, he wasn't at Camp Pendleton, but he was living there when Ray, and then he went into the Marine Corps. He was there when Ray Davis got shot, and he was around. He could have easily done Domingos Edwards. He could have easily done a lot of those murders, and a really good suspect in the honeymoon.
Yeah.
Right. There were other couples who were shot with a .22. Then that case was never cracked. So I think you guys are right, and I've never been able to really get around to telling you how right you were until now. So now, finally, I can start revealing all secrets. And you're going to be on my show a lot. I'll be on your show a lot, because I want to hear a lot more, not only about Avery and Cheney, but about Braden and his friends who fit into all of this stuff. Because I'm telling you, the Zodiac murders don't only have to do with defense contractors, but those cryptograms have everything to do with how Snook, he had a case upheld by the United States Supreme Court. He and Tony Poe and all the stuff going on with all this drug trafficking. And speaking of the murder of Paul Stein, I'll leave your listeners with a cliffhanger here. It is no coincidence that Armand Pellicetti was the first person to arrive at the scene of the shooting of Paul Stein. No coincidence whatsoever. Do you know anything about him?
Never did a deep dive into him. I know more about Falk, of course, but
well, he was a journalist. Did you know he was a journalist?
I don't think so.
I will reveal those secrets, but he's also a very spooky character. And all of a sudden, the murder of Paul Stein makes perfect sense.
No, we'll look forward to that. Druser tells me that this guy here, I'll say that for another time. This guy on the left that's by the other photo with the tie on, that's another Jim Phillips. So that was just a false ID on
different
that.
Jim Phillips. Okay. But see, Jim Phillips does this. Well, I don't think it's a coincidence. Jim Phillips, because he worked as a landlord, had access to the system. He could upload a lot of false information about himself over the years, built a false trail. It's very difficult to know very much of anything about Jim. But I do know this. He's only been married once legally in the United States. And that wife you've never heard of. When the police questioned him and he said that he'd spent the day with his wife, Shirley, they weren't married either. He and Shirley never got married either. The only woman he ever married, her father, was a Hollywood abortion doctor when abortion was still illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you're talking about Manson again, because he worked at those free clinics and probably worked with, when he was back in the day, probably worked with Dr. George Hodel in that abortion ring. That was the only, and he gave them
Black Dahlia.
Was it $5,000? Jim and Shirley, Jim bought a house with like $5,000 supposedly from his father-in-law, but his only actual wife is more interesting. I mean, this is a guy who, he pretends to be a spook and he's a little bit spooky. He's basically an Operation Mockingbird guy. A CIA plant in the hippy-dippy commie journalism world. And again, he and his Sonny Lewis, common law wife, they're really into publishing this organic farming news kind of stuff, which links them directly to Minot, North Dakota, and Barry DeCinco and the Son of Sam case.
There it goes. That's it all in right there.
And you can go to Walmart right now and buy Morningstar products from Morningstar Communal Farm outside of San Francisco. And they're one of those communes that Jim would have been associated with. They're still in business. That's Morningstar Farms. And Green Greenfield Ranch up by Ukiah. See, that's all where Hal Snook
Snook's
is from
from Ukiah.
Ukiah. He's from Ukiah. His family owned a bunch of ranch land, and all these ranchers are starting to, because a lot of these communes were very serious. They really studied organic agriculture. They really did. These were very serious communal farming communities, kind of like the Amish, kind of like, people who live New Harmony, Indiana. They start these communes. They did have pedophile problems at several of them, and that includes Morningstar. I'm not saying they still have a problem, but Morningstar at the time. Well, that's also where Jim Jones's first People's Temple commune was founded, at Ukiah. Now, it wasn't on the grounds of Greenfield. Sometimes these families get together and then they'll rent. So these families, they sent their kids to college, all doctors and lawyers now. They don't want to run the family farm, don't want to run the family ranch. So they're renting farmland to these intentional living communities. That's the phrase I was looking for. These are legal entities, and Morningstar Farms is still around. So they were renting farmland to them. Did the Snook family rent farm ground to Jim Jones? I mean, there's this stuff suddenly, once you see the key, all of a sudden you just see how it all fits together. But
That's it.
Just hundreds of episodes to show people. You and I will be YouTubers. I want to see you on another show. I want to see you on another show.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that's we get a Braden show soon. That's my conspiracy.
I want to put in a quick plug for my stuff. I have also cracked the phony disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Madeleine McCann was not kidnapped and murdered by pedophiles. She's alive and well and was raised by a very nice middle-class foster family.
How do you know that?
Nice
how did you find that out?
Well, here's the funny thing. The original police reports have become available to the public, and the solution to the case is right there. What really happened to Madeleine McCann was she was the bait in a massive multinational sting operation that was taking place in Praia de Luz, Portugal, the week that she disappeared, and nobody noticed. What happened was, apparently, I'll be careful about this, but he lives in England. Her so-called father, Gerald McCann, went on the dark web and made arrangements to have her kidnapped.
Right.
I can show you. It was Tanner Man. Tanner Man was, but Kate at that time, Kate had no idea. Their friends had no idea. Everybody has been told over the years that the McCann's friends lied to police to cover up for the McCanns, because everybody thinks that the friends, the Tapas 7, and the other witnesses, they think those stories somehow make Gerald McCann look less guilty. What they don't realize is all of those witness statements prove that Gerald McCann is 10,000% guilty. Tanner Man is not only real, I can not only prove exactly who Tanner Man is, but it also proves that this was part of a sting operation. I've on my premium website, I can't do these episodes on YouTube. I don't break any laws, but I show you pictures of Tanner Man, and I can show you a couple pictures of Madeleine as she's growing up with this foster family, and there's just no doubt it's her. Like, in this case, didn't take very long to crack either. As a matter of fact, what I realized was, when reading these, even before I read the witness statements, I realized there's a guy who was talking to Gerald McCann while the kidnapping, while Madeleine went out the window in the arms of Tanner Man. And he claimed he didn't see Tanner Man. He's like one of the first people to undermine Jane Tanner's story. When you find out who he is, you know what happened. And I found Madeleine like that. It was so easy.
It does seem to be squashed out there.
Well, the thing is, here's the thing. She's in no danger. I have to watch out I don't invade her privacy. She might not really be sure who she is. But the first thing I noticed was they were treating her the same way the FBI treats, like, Jimmy Hoffa. They pretend they're dead. When somebody disappears in a witness protection program, the cops don't say we put them in the witness protection program. They pretend that they're dead. So that's what happened to Madeleine McCann. She might not know who she is, or if she does know who she is, she might be it's the happy ending is she's fine. It just broke Kate's heart because Kate had no idea what was going on. She told the truth right alongside everybody else. And when you read the original police reports, it turns out the second time they talked to Gerald McCann, he's admitting that he lied the first time. He admits that he's the one who tampered with the window and the shutter. And then you go back and read the police reports, and it's very obvious what happened. And it's very obvious that Gerald McCann was in on it and Kate was not. And it turns out that Scotland Yard and the Home Office and the London Metropolitan Police Department had 4 of their most important undercover operatives running this massive multi-year sting operation. 4 of them were in prior to Luce, and 2 of them were even staying in the same apartment complex with the McCanns. 2 of them were convicted pedophiles who had turned informant. And exactly one of them is almost the only person known that we know of. See, Praia de Luz the Ocean Club Resort was empty at the time. It was the off season. Nobody was there.
Yeah, I remember that.
The only person out of those 4 people the only person who was staying at the Ocean Club who doesn't have an alibi for the moment that Madeleine McCann went out the window turns out to be Tanner Man. And it's one of these 4 operatives who were working for Scotland Yard. So that case was very easy to crack. But it's another example of governments doing something a little bit shady for a good reason and then lying about it on a massive scale. A massive, massive scale.
That's what they do.
And all these phony suspects, just like Son of Sam, just like Zodiac, just like... So that's where we are now. I'm glad you let me come on here.
We're caught up now.
People over.
Now I know where you were going, but yeah, the third person at Blue Rocks knew for sure.
That was something.
And then you're going to do this next time.
So if there was a third person in the front seat, because there's no way Mike was in the front seat when the shooting started. And see, there's all this rigmarole explaining about why Mike was in the back seat. No, he was in the back seat because he was in the back seat the whole time. Somebody else opened that door after Mike got in the car. And he got out of the car because the door was already open, not because he opened it, because those are not his fingerprints on the car door handle. Those belong to somebody else. The police knew that for sure. And whoever it was the last person to open that door. And the logical explanation is they got in the front seat because Mike was not in the front seat when the shooting started. There's no way that happened. There's just no way. So who that person was, I think it might have been Christina, but there's really no other clue to that except this code within the code.
Yep, the code.
Which appears to predict the Paul Stein murder, which turns out to be the most interesting one. So there we are. And I've got you're going to come on my show real soon, and I'm going to, no, we're not. We just barely told people what we're going to talk about.
That's the ring around the wider bubble of information. That's how we'll call it.
So,
that's been fun, man.
Thank you so much.
So we got this Allen thing coming out. We'll see where that goes. Hopefully Andrew will put something together with the rest of the material he has from us, because I mean they've got enough there to make a second one. No problem.
And a bunch of other people. There's already enough, and I think they're waiting. It's just a television audience. You can only throw so much information at to do this book.
That's the way. It's too much
to do this book. To do this book as a TV series, the outline was 39 hours, and there's nobody going to spend that kind of money on that.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot to get in.
It's a great documentary. Watch it. They also, most of those
very
people.
Good. Very well done.
Most of those people, not Andrew. Now, he's done some other really cool stuff. But most of those people were involved in the disappearance of Mara Murray documentary, which is also very well done.
Texas crew out of Austin did that. Yeah, great documentary on Mara Murray.
Those are they're all
good
fantastic
guys,
people.
Really good guys, Ben.
Mm-hmm. So, David Carabinas is kind of my hero. He started his own production company and really made a success of it. And so I got to work with him on this project. This whole thing was, I was always trying to get on another show and prove myself and maybe get a series and then maybe do a really good one. Well, a really good one got made right out of the box, and the whole experience. And by the way, just for your viewers to know, this is the authentic shirt I do wear on
In the
the
show.
documentary. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
This is the
I think that's the one you're
shirt.
wearing at Lake Herman Road.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they let me do that. They don't always know it. I got my way on everything.
Yeah.
But I'm sneaky, and I had a lot of I've had some experience in the business, but
Yeah.
they really, really treated me. I assume they treated you well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would work for them again in a heartbeat. And
Me too.
yeah, there's a lot more. They could put together a couple of, even from stuff I was involved with, they could put together a couple more episodes if somebody would pay them for the episodes. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
They're probably waiting to see what happens with this Netflix series.
Yeah,
And
we'll see where that goes. That's coming up pretty quick. So I don't know how long they've been working on it. Probably at least a year since the Seawaters took their channel down. So I know that when they took their channel down, I figured something was going on like that.
Now, you know who Manny Grossman is, right? The guy who's been doing.
Yeah.
There's rumor going around. Don't know if it's true. I didn't hear from him directly, but he might have a deal with Netflix because he knows Josh Zeman, and Josh Zeman doing a follow up
for Son of Sam.
Yeah. So Manny's real good. He ought to have, he doesn't like me for some reason, but we have this little club. Manny has an open invitation to come on my show too. It's me, you, Ross, Ned.
Same here.
Maybe a couple other people have an open invitation. Come on. I'll start doing more where you guys can just call in and say hi. I've been doing these massive encyclopedic episodes on my show that I'm going to cut back on from now on and do more streams, but a little bit shorter. People will not have to, if you want to watch Madeleine McCann, if you want to know what really happened to JohnBenet Ramsay and how all this ties together, I've barely scratched the surface of that. There were other super horrifying pedophile crimes that were happening in Boulder at that time, identical to the wounds on JohnBenet. JohnBenet was killed by accident. She was tortured on purpose. She died by accident. Well, they had to kill her. This was a last minute thing. Anyhow. And once again, you have these phony ransom notes. You have these phony letters. Well, the funny thing is, when Kelsey Grammer's sister got murdered, the guy who cracked that case is named Lou Smith, and he infiltrated.
I remember Lou Smith from the case.
He volunteered to help Boulder Police Department, and once he learned all the evidence they had against the Ramsays, he threw a big fit and walked out of Boulder Police Department and went to work for the Ramsays. Now, what's really funny about that is another expert witness in the Ramsay case who said four forensic experts said that they believed that JohnBenet had been molested over a period of time.
Right.
One forensic expert, right? That sure makes John look guilty. So this forensic expert.
Yeah, they're having John Ramsay at the crime con. I mean, that's just a bad look. Sorry, folks.
This renowned forensic pathologist comes swooping in and says, no, she wasn't molested before. And puts a kibosh on the whole thing because he's famous. You know what his name is?
Who?
I'll give you a hint. He's the exact same forensic pathologist who claimed...
Henry Lee? No, I can't remember. He did some stuff on it.
He claimed that the JFK autopsy had been botched. That's such bullshit. Those doctors who did that autopsy were the world's foremost experts on combat injuries,
absolutely,
including getting shot in the head with a sniper's rifle. They wrote the textbook on it. They did not botch that autopsy. He's the same forensic pathologist who said, we don't need to do an autopsy on Mary Jo Kopechne. There's two Kennedy cases. He's the exact same forensic pathologist who said that the genital mutilations on the victims of the West Memphis 3 case, he said, oh, no, that was a snapping turtle.
Was it Bodden?
He's the exact same forensic expert who, recently, RFK Jr.'s best friend from prep school was accused of murdering Martha Moxley, and they finally got a conviction, right?
Was Skakel? I thought it was Skakel. Which was the Kennedy cousin, right?
So the forensic expert who swooped in at the time and gave Skakel an alibi by having a completely different opinion on the time of death of Martha Moxley. That's the same guy. Now, have you heard of North Fox Island? And then there's the North Fox Island pedophile scandal, that island that's very close to Charlevoix, Michigan. You've heard of that case, and you've heard of the Timothy King case. Timothy King was a little boy who was, right? The Timothy King's body was literally somebody carried his body across the street and dumped it in the ditch so it would be in another county so that the forensic examiner would do that autopsy. That's the same guy. The same guy. The same guy.
Who was it?
Now, have you heard of the there's a very heartbreaking documentary you must watch on Netflix called The Keepers about the murder of this nun who was exposing this child molestation at these Catholic schools in Baltimore, the Sister Kathy case. The forensic pathologist. Okay, there's a guy, prime suspect. It was some cops and some priests, and they were trafficking these children. They had a suspect, blah, 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 blah. It all came down to time of death. Well, this renowned forensic pathologist comes swooping in and gives him an alibi by rendering a completely different opinion about the time of death. It was one guy. I'm going to give you one more hint. His parents were Polish Jews. They were the camp doctors at the very first concentration camp specifically for Jews. They were allowed to leave Germany with their money and their property intact right before Adolf Eichmann took over the Office of Jewish Immigration. They come to America. Their son grows up to be the renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Werner Spitz.
Oh,
and
there you go.
He's in on every single one of these cases, and he's spooky. And he and Lou Smith are like this.
That's a nice tie right there.
So, thank you for listening.
I've retained it all.
You ever wonder what I do in my off hours?
Now we know.
But you guys are, it's just so great. And Manny, he does great episodes on his show.
Yeah, he does. I watched most of his first ones.
So me, you, Manny, Ross, Ned, and there's a couple other really good ones. There's one called Writing Jewels that now is in a feud with Manny. She does pretty good stuff. So we've got some really good true crime stuff out there, guys. Thank everybody for your support. Anybody who's ever bought this book, anybody who's ever watched the documentary.
The link is in the description.
But my private premium website will be going away pretty soon. Cases like, if you want to know what really happened to JohnBenet and who really did it, I can show you where the body was really hidden, all that stuff. If you want to know what really happened to Madeleine McCann, if you want to know what really happened to Donald Trump at Butler, Pennsylvania, I cannot show those episodes on YouTube. So they're on my private website. So that's going away pretty soon, but then I'll be all YouTube. There is a members only $10. You can start paying for that now. If you don't care about those cases, you just care about Zodiac, I'll start doing premium episodes about Zodiac because I got several hundred of those to do. And I'll be doing more premium episodes about Manson, once again, when you get the actual case files from the Tate LaBianca murders, they tell a totally different story.
Yeah.
There is no way the Manson family murdered anybody. All they did was tamper with the crime scene. But that's a whole other podcast episode.
It was good, Professor. It always is.
And Josh Zeman, I will give him credit for this. He got all the original, it's got to be, we think it's him, from the original police reports from the Son of Sam shootings. And one more time, they tell a totally different story from the myth. So thank you, Drew Hurst Beeson, the best true crime conspiracy podcaster out there, bar none. And all of your listeners, thank you so much.
Thanks. We'll do it again soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Patty, for keeping the chatters there. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. Thanks, Professor.
Mwah.